Today's video is sponsored by Curiosity Stream. This is an impressive streaming service that offers thousands of documentaries and non-fiction titles, including original content created by some of the world's best filmmakers. It's available worldwide on several different platforms, from Xbox, Roku, and Android, to iOS, Apple TV, Amazon Fire, and many more. What's more, it has a price of less than $20 a year. That's $1.67 a month for some amazing content. Curiosity is the world's first streaming service addressing that lifelong quest to learn, explore, and understand. It's the brand for people who simply want to know more. It covers science, nature, history, technology, music, and much more. Plus, it's constantly updating and adding new shows every week. Now, if anyone is big into the history of the Second World War, and let's face it, who isn't, then I highly recommend you checking out the Apocalypse World War II series. It's got some amazing first-hand footage. If you go to the link below at curiositystream.com/flashpoint and use the promo code FLASHPOINT, you'll be helping out my channel and will get an additional 25% off. So that's now down to $15 a year. So do yourself a favor, if you are a fan of learning, hit that link and start your journey today. And now folks, for the video you've been waiting for. Imad ad-Din Zengi was born into a world of near-continuous warfare. His father, the governor of Aleppo, was killed in battle against the emir of Damascus when he was about 10. He was only a young teen when a massive Frankish army invaded from the west, destroyed one Muslim army after the next, and conquered Jerusalem in 1099, committing atrocity in their path. The Crusaders, as they'd be known, established a powerful state in the Levant, and as Imad ad-Din grew into a young adult, he watched as they expanded their domain, brushing aside the heavily divided Islamic world. But despite the fierce military orders that were created to defend what was now Crusader land, and the imposing ring of fortifications that they had built, the position of the Latins was never certain. It was not long after this that Imad ad-Din Zengi was adopted by a man named Jakermish, who happened to be the Atabeg of Mosul and had a flair for combat himself. In 1104, Zengi followed his new father into battle and witnessed the destruction of a Crusader army near the city of Harran. The Battle of Harran crippled the offensive capability of the county of Edessa, one of the Crusader states. It also instilled in Imad ad-Din that the Latins of the West could be defeated, but in order to ensure victory, a united Islamic response was needed. This concept, by the way, would be at the core of this man's actions for the rest of his life. In the year 1127, Zengi came to power in Mosul, and the next year he brought Aleppo under his control. Within a few years, he had expanded his power base to include Hama and several other cities that lay to his north. However, not all of his campaigns were successful. He was defeated at Damascus, Homs, and Baghdad, but the man was ruthless and never gave up. He attacked with little remorse and had an eye for spotting his enemies' weaknesses. By the late 1130s, he had gained considerable power at the expense of his neighbors, both Muslim and Christian alike. And then, in 1144, he took this to an all-new level. He advanced on the county of Edessa. The Crusader state was a salient that was surrounded on three sides by Muslim territory. The population was relatively small, and after years of military defeats and political infighting, it had almost no offensive capability whatsoever. It was weak, and Zengi knew it. His army marched in and he laid siege to the city of Edessa for a month. Then, on Christmas Eve of 1144, his forces managed to breach the city walls and a frenzied bloodbath ensued. The Latin defenders were executed and many of the city's inhabitants were simply massacred. Now, news of the fall of Edessa and subsequently the loss of the county of Edessa spread quickly to Europe. It was a shock to the sense of invulnerability that the Crusader states had previously enjoyed. The response was equally formidable. Pope Eugenius III called for another crusade. It was a man by the name of Bernard of Clairvaux, a Benedictine monk gifted with an awe-inspiring ability for oratory, who took it upon himself to advocate the new pilgrimage far and wide. His words were rousing, spirited, and struck home with peasant and lord alike. This time, not just princes, but kings of Europe would answer the call and bear the cross. Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany raised massive armies and began to move towards the Holy Land. Zengi may have united a good portion of the Islamic world and had become powerful. If the Latins had brought holy war during the First Crusade, Imad ad-Din had answered by bringing down a Crusader state. His military response was regarded as being the beginning of a true jihad. If so, this jihad was about to face its first real trial, because now the Second Crusade was bearing down upon it. Conrad III, leading his German contingent and bringing along his nephew, the future Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, departed in May of 1147. They followed a path near the Danube River and arrived in Constantinople on September 10th. But relations between the Germans and the Byzantine were strained at best. Armed conflict would break out on several occasions, of which it should be mentioned that the Byzantine army managed to give the Germans a bloody nose in their engagements. The Emperor Manuel I had reason to fear now that the Crusaders would attack the city. In fact, John Julius Norwich recounted just how delicate the situation really was. Quote, Manuel I Komnenos, who fully understood the nightmare that the First Crusade had caused his grandfather half a century before, had no wish to see it repeated. He undertook to provide food and supplies for the crusading armies, but emphasized that everything would have to be paid for, and, more importantly, all the leaders would be required once again to take an oath of fealty to him. Meanwhile, any faint hopes that he might have entertained about the quality of the new Crusaders were soon dashed. The German army that set off in May of 1147 seemed to have ranged from the religious fanatics to the rabble of footloose ne'er-do-wells and fugitives from justice, attracted as always by the promise of absolution. Hardly had they entered Byzantine territory than they began pillaging, ravaging, raping, and even murdering as the mood took them. And when the army reached Constantinople in mid-September, relations between the Germans and the Greeks could hardly have been worse. End quote. Conrad III, who sensed this growing animosity, not to mention the fact that his troops were beaten by the Byzantine, decided to cross into Asia Minor and not await the French. He didn't make it very far. On October 25, 1147, the Seljuk attacked him near Dorylaeum, just as Bohemond was in the First Crusade. But the German king lacked Bohemond's tactical brilliance. His forces were divided and fell into the trap of a Turkish feigned retreat. The Second Battle of Dorylaeum was a complete and total disaster. Crusader casualties were extreme. By some sources, nearly 90% of Conrad's forces were wiped out. The Byzantine were later blamed for this defeat, as it was rumored that they had been in league with the Seljuk all along. Now, what was left of the German contingent limped its way back to friendly territory where it met up with the French army. The French would do a little better. They were able to repulse a Turkish attack near Ephesus. But John Julius Norwich would explain what happened next. Quote, The Second Crusade had been a fiasco. Conrad, with a few survivors of Dorylaeum, had continued in the company of the French to Ephesus, where he had fallen ill. Manuel I Komnenos sailed down from Constantinople and brought him back to the palace, where he had personally nursed him back to health. Then, in 1148, he had provided ships to carry him to Palestine. The French, meanwhile, had had an agonizing passage through Anatolia. Although Louis had ignored the emperor's warnings to keep to the coast, he persisted in attributing every hostile encounter to Byzantine treachery and rapidly developed an almost psychopathic resentment against the Greeks. Finally, he had taken ship, leaving his followers to struggle on as best they might. Only around Easter of 1148 had the last remnant of the great host reached Antioch. End quote. Thus, Conrad III and Louis VII decided to leave their respective armies and take ship to the Holy Land. In spring of 1148, Conrad arrived in Acre and Louis in Antioch. But now that they were in the Levant, the real question was what to do next. The French and Germans met up with their Crusader colleagues in Jerusalem in April of 1148. A council of war was later formed near Acre. The plan that they came up with was not to take Edessa, which at this point had been destroyed, but rather go after Damascus. This actually made strategic sense. Edessa would not only be a difficult target to reach, but also would be a very difficult city to defend. Damascus, on the other hand, was closer, would be easier to hold, a much more vibrant city, and then could be used as a base of operation for further military offensive action. But despite the good reasoning, the operation would be ill-fated from the beginning, hampered by poor logistics and tactical planning. What's more, the defenders of the city knew of the incoming force, had already strengthened the defenses, and were resolved to fight. Conrad III, Louis VII, and their respective armies, now accompanied by King Baldwin III of Jerusalem, set out from Tiberias in mid-July. The Crusaders arrived at Damascus on July 23, 1148, and began the attack the next day. They met intense resistance as they attempted to lay siege. Within a mere 5 days of their arrival, the Crusaders had made almost no progress, had sustained considerable casualties. And to complicate the matter even further, a Muslim relief army under the command of a one Nuraddin, much more on him in a bit, had arrived on the scene. The Crusaders decided then and there to abandon the entire endeavor. In ignominious defeat, they retreated from Damascus, each king feeling betrayed and resentful of the other. And of course, when in doubt, the Byzantine were also to blame. The Second Crusade was a complete disaster. The jihad that was started with the fall of Edessa had passed its first test. It would now continue to gain determination. Meanwhile, for the Eastern Empire, it was a political disaster. The resentment of the Second Crusade would linger and make it almost impossible for Constantinople to gain allies. But despite the failure of the Second Crusade and the bad blood that it created, this would still be a very vibrant time for the Byzantine. Emerging from a period where the Eastern Empire was on the verge of annihilation, Alexios I Komnenos had set Byzantium on the path to recovery that would later be regarded as the Komnenian Restoration. By the time of Alexios' death in 1118, the government was partially reformed, the Roman army and navy strengthened, and the economy was doing relatively better, though by the end of Alexios' reign, not so much. But lands in the Balkans, islands in the Aegean, and a good portion of western Anatolia were retaken. Alexios had enjoyed a long reign of power that spanned 37 years. His son and his grandson were to enjoy long reigns as well. Thus, in 1118, Alexios was succeeded by his son, John II Komnenos, who was eloquently described by Norwich as, quote, "At the time of his ascension, John Komnenos was a month short of his 30th birthday. Even his admirers admitted that he was physically ill-favored, but they gave him the nickname John the Beautiful. This was not intended ironically, it referred not to his body, but to his soul. Levity he hated, luxury he frowned upon. Today, most of us would find him an insufferable companion, but in 12th century Byzantium, he was loved." First of all, he was no hypocrite, his piety was genuine and his integrity complete. Second, there was a gentle, merciful side to his nature that in his day was rare indeed. He was generous too. No emperor ever dispensed charity with more lavish. Like his father, John Komnenos was a soldier. He too saw the empire as a sacred trust. But whereas Alexius had been largely content to defend it, John saw his duty in more positive terms: to liberate all territory occupied by the infidel and to restore Byzantium to its ancient glory. End quote. John spent most of his life on campaign, but the man was cautious in his military endeavors, never risking a pitched battle unless he absolutely had to. Rather, he systematically, methodically laid siege and took one enemy strong point after another. He built on his father's success, holding or advancing the borders of his empire. In the west, like his father, he had to contend with another Pecheneg invasion. At the Battle of Beroia in 1122, his forces encountered a Pecheneg army that had assembled an imposing defensive position. A fort of encircled wagons, protected by a ditch, had been assembled. John's initial assaults were repulsed with significant casualties, and the emperor himself was wounded in the leg by an arrow. However, he attacked again, but this time brought in his elite Varangian guard. They used their famed Danish battle axes to literally hack their way through the wagons. Once the Pecheneg line was breached, the imperial army exploited it. On that day, John's forces inflicted so many casualties that the Pechenegs would never again be an independent nation. Instead, they would be incorporated into the Eastern Roman army, making it even more powerful. The Balkans were thus relatively secured, but to further protect his western lands and to offset a potential rival, John sent financial subsidiaries to the Holy Roman Emperor, who was then engaged in fighting the newly crowned Roger II of Sicily. His rise to power just happened to threaten Byzantine interests, and the emperor just seemed to have the bandwidth to get politically invasive. But it would be in the east where John's destiny really resided. Whereas his father had taken the western coast of Asia Minor, John expanded imperial lands into the interior by exploiting the disunited Seljuk. He built fortresses and training facilities for his expanding army as he went. The emperor also sent his troops along the southern coast of Anatolia, securing lands into Cilicia and establishing a land route to the Crusader states. But then, in 1142, he prepared for the greatest campaign of his life, to invade Syria. He deployed his well-trained army towards Antioch. Though at the time it was in Crusader hands, John reasoned the city had always been Byzantine property. However, on the eve of initiating this campaign, John was wounded by scraping against an arrow laced with poison that spread quickly into his bloodstream. Some historians don't consider this an accident, but rather an assassination. But either way, he wouldn't survive. John Julius Norwich gives his final days, quote, "On April 5, 1143, the dying emperor called a council to announce his successor. Both his sons, he said, were fine young men. Isaac, however, was prone to anger, while Manuel possessed a gentleness which enabled him to listen carefully to advice. It was therefore Manuel, the youngest of his children, who should succeed him. Turning to his son, he took the imperial diadem and lowered it on the young man's head, then draped the purple robe across his shoulders. He lived on for 3 more days. His death on April 8, 1143 was pious, efficient, and well-ordered, like his life. Had he been granted just a few more years, he would surely have extended Byzantine power deep into Syria, and might indeed have gone a long way towards undoing the damage sustained at Manzikert. Dying as he did at only 53, he was obliged to leave his work unfinished. Yet he could take comfort in the knowledge that his son, Manuel, would prove a worthy successor." End quote. Manuel I Komnenos would reign like his grandfather Alexius for 37 years. He was a tall man regarded as being handsome, charming, and a bit of a hedonist. In direct contrast to his father, he loved pleasure and the pursuit of, well, more pleasure. But he was also extremely intelligent, cultivated, and had a passion for debate. Plus, he was renowned as being an astute diplomat. Indeed, it was under his reign that the Second Crusade barreled its way through. However, he found himself in a difficult situation in that he also had an adoration of Western European culture. To the absolute disdain of his own people, he reached out to the Roman Catholic Church for reconciliation. He would host jousting tournaments and would incorporate aspects of Western attire. But even worse, he was perceived as showing favoritism to Westerners that resided in Constantinople, especially the Venetians. Whereas his predecessors attempted to limit the population of the Western Europeans in the great city, he appeared to embrace them. It should be emphasized that their numbers, again a big percentage of them being Venetians, grew considerably under Manuel's reign. But mark my words, this bred an intense hatred in the Eastern Romans. Despite this, Manuel continued his father's policy to expand the empire. He deployed his troops west into the Balkans. Near the river Sava in 1167, a Byzantine force took on a Hungarian army in what would later be known as the Battle of Sirmium. Initially, the Romans began to lose ground. But then the imperial heavy cavalry rallied the sagging Byzantine formation and brought their heavy maces to bear. They won the day by smashing the Hungarians into submission, both figuratively and literally. Indeed, the king of Hungary had to sue for peace and became a vassal, thus extending Byzantine control to the Western Balkans. Manuel would also be involved in campaigns to fight Roger II of Sicily, and at one point established an alliance with the king of Jerusalem to invade Fatimid Egypt, though in the end this didn't amount to much. Now that all said about the West, the emperor would soon have his hands full in the East. Raynald of Chatillon was the son of a minor nobleman who had joined the Second Crusade and decided to stay in the Levant. According to some, the man really couldn't go back. He was a fierce warrior, a ruthless opportunist, and according to some accounts harbored a somewhat malevolent spirit. In 1153, he seized an opportunity and married his way into becoming the Prince of Antioch. From that point onward, Raynald would make a name for himself as being a very dangerous man. What can I say, the man just had this ability to really tick people off. He invaded Byzantine Cyprus in 1156 and unleashed what Norwich would describe as an orgy of devastation and desecration such as the island had never before known. Thus, it was not surprising that when Manuel marched his army against Raynald, the emperor had vengeance in his heart. Upon seeing this humongous force that was bringing the thunder down with him, Raynald did what any man of action would do. He shaved his head, dressed himself in sackcloth, groveled at the emperor's feet, and begged for forgiveness. Surprisingly, Manuel accepted the apology with the condition that Antioch would now be his vassal, there would once again be a Greek patriarch, and that the great city would be garrisoned with Byzantine troops. It was a deal that Raynald couldn't refuse. And so on Easter Sunday, April 12, 1159, Manuel triumphantly entered Antioch as its de facto ruler. The story with Raynald would not end here. But for the emperor, his attention would soon be drawn to a new enemy. After Antioch, Cilicia, and most of the southern coast of Asia Minor were secured, the emperor then sent his men against their longtime rival, the Seljuk, just as his forefathers had done. But in 1176, as the imperial army was moving through a narrow mountain pass, it was ambushed at what would be known as the Battle of Myrocephalon. While it was a significant defeat, it didn't cripple the Roman army. Manuel would rally his forces and the next year would win at the Battle of Hylian, effectively keeping the Seljuk at bay. Thus, Manuel I Komnenos would rule over the Byzantine Empire at the height of its expansion during the Komnenian Restoration. He came the closest to soothing ties with the Western Church, the Crusader states, and the powers of Western Europe. Indeed, his reign saw the contenders of the Eastern Roman Empire held in check either diplomatically or militarily, and all this while Constantinople and her people flourished. But this golden age was not to persist, and what's more, this moment in the sun for the Byzantine Empire would again be its very last. Now, while the official end date of the Komnenian Restoration is 1185, for all intents and purposes it really ended with the death of Manuel I in 1180. His son, Alexios II, was too young to rule. He and his regent would soon be overthrown in a coup. In his place, the despotic Andronicus I Komnenos would come to power and would prove to be an exceptionally poor ruler. The Eastern Empire would fragment and fall into the depths of an extremely dark time, but more on that in a bit. Meanwhile, to the south in Syria, the Jihad started with the fall of Edessa and perpetuated with the failure of the Second Crusade, would lay the foundation of a new empire that would take the Middle East by storm. The fall of Edessa in 1144 was the crowning achievement of Ahmad-ad-Din Zengi, but he was not to enjoy it for long. Nearly 2 years later, in 1146, the Sultan was killed by one of his own servants. Ahmad-ad-Din Zengi was then succeeded by his second son, Nuraddin, who came to power in Aleppo while his brother took Mosul. Nuraddin inherited the momentum that his father had started and would carry it to an all-new level. Hostilities with the Crusader states at this time was becoming intense, but Nuraddin proved that he was truly his father's son, a warrior incarnate, and some would argue that he was even more ruthless. In the same year that he came to power, he defeated a Crusader attempt to retake Edessa. In reprisal to those who supported the Crusaders in this attempt, he destroyed the city's fortifications, slaughtered the local Armenian Christians, and sold much of the population into slavery, rendering Edessa a mere shadow of its former status. When the Second Crusade failed at the walls of Damascus, it was truly Nuraddin's chance to prove his dedication to the Jihad. On June 29, 1149, he destroyed the army of Antioch at the Battle of Inab. His forces managed to kill their prince, Raymond of Antioch, and Nuraddin sent his head as a trophy back to the caliph in Baghdad. This victory over the infidel made Nuraddin the embodiment of holy war to his people. Many flocked to his banner, his army and his prestige grew, and thus he rapidly was able to expand his domain. Mosul would soon come under his control, and in 1154, Damascus was taken when its weak leader was overthrown. When the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos asserted his control over Antioch in 1159, Nuraddin masterfully made an alliance with the Eastern Romans against the Seljuk. This effectively secured the Sultan's northern border with the Byzantine and gave him the initiative to expand his lands further. Nuraddin went to work. His primary focus was to secure his hold over Syria. But far to the south, the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt was falling apart under extremely unstable leadership. This, of course, would come to the attention of King Amalric of Jerusalem, who sensed an opportunity, and so in 1163 the king sent in his army to secure the Nile Delta. As a result, the Fatimids would become even more divided into rival factions, of which one faction invited Nuraddin to come in and help them against their rivals, in exchange for about a third of the annual revenue. So in the very same year that the Crusaders had invaded Egypt, 1163, Nuraddin sent in one of his best Kurdish generals. The man's name was Asad-ad-Din Shurka bin Shadi, but better known as Shurka. For the next 6 years, in a series of campaigns, Shurka fought relentlessly to advance his master Nuraddin's interests in Egypt. In a tumultuous maelstrom of battles, skirmishes, backstabbing, and rapidly shifting Fatimid political alliances, Shirkuh emerged the victor. In January of 1169, he marched into Cairo, became the vizier, and executed all of his opposition. Though technically still under Nuraddin, Shirkuh was now the sole ruler of Egypt, one of the wealthiest of lands in the medieval age. He now had immense wealth, had ascended to a position of great power, and had an impressive army under his control. But then, 2 months later, he, died. As fate would have it, it would be his humble nephew, who had followed him through the rigors of the Egyptian campaign, that would succeed him as vizier. This man's name was Al-Nasir Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, but he would be known to history by another name. This man would be known as Saladin. Saladin was born in 1137 in the city of Tikrit on the Tigris River, but a dispute with the local lord forced his family to move. He grew up in the shadow of the Crusader states and was still a young boy when Edessa fell. The struggle for him between Islam and Christianity was always palpable. Eventually, he and his family settled in Damascus, where the cosmopolitan nature of the city afforded him an excellent education. He was an avid reader, extremely intelligent, and hungry for knowledge. He became well acquainted in many fields: astronomy, philosophy, law, theology, to name a few. James Reston, in his book, Warriors of God, describes the young Manuel, quote, "Though he was slight of build, his intelligence, his mannerliness, his generosity, and his piety were noticed in the palaces of Damascus. He was drawn to wine and women in his adolescence, but the seriousness of the historical situation eventually impressed him, and he renounced these temptations." Later, it would be said that from the education of his sovereign, Nuraddin, Yusuf, later known as Saladin, learned to walk the path of righteousness, to act virtuously, and to be zealous in waging war against the infidels. In the court of Damascus, the principle of striving in Allah's cause was emphasized, and the youth took to heart his invocation in the Quran: "Those who strive in our cause will surely guide in our way, for Allah is with those who do right." End quote. Saladin's education would continue, now in the field of warfare, when he joined the army at the age of 14. 2 years later, in 1163, he would follow his uncle Shirkuh into Egypt as ordered by Nuraddin. As mentioned before, Egypt was secured after 6 years of intense fighting in January of 1169, and Shirkuh died 2 months later. And by the way, by some chroniclers, it has been said that poison was involved. James Reston explains what happened next. Quote, "Nuraddin settled on Saladin as his uncle's successor. The young soldier was chosen not because of his strengths, but because of his perceived weaknesses of his youth and inexperience. In truth, Nuraddin didn't want a powerful competitor in Cairo, and he was certain that he could control his malleable and polite ward. In this, he would be disappointed." End quote. The 32-year-old new vizier declared his undying loyalty to Nuraddin and set to work supplanting Shiite with Sunni Islam in Egypt. But under this veneer, Saladin was already busy implementing his own agenda. He systematically raised military forces that were loyal only to him while placing members of his own family in key positions in government. He revitalized trade networks and established a substantial fleet in order to better protect the sea lanes of the Mediterranean and the Red Seas. By making this move, the money began to just pour in, making the new vizier immensely rich. Now with that money, Saladin became a patron to his people, earning their adoration. A vast building project was established with a strong emphasis on education. Schools, libraries, and even a college were built. Money was then sent to Mecca and Medina, and so Saladin gained even more esteem as being a patron of the holy places of Islam. But this rising wealth and popularity didn't sit well with Nuraddin, who ordered his subordinate to return to Damascus immediately. Saladin, however, came up with numerous excuses why he couldn't return and reasserted that he was doing nothing but being loyal. Nuraddin didn't buy it. In 1174, the Sultan raised an enormous army with the intent to take back Egypt, and most likely execute his vizier in the process. For Saladin, it would seem that the game was up. I mean, after all, his rightful lord was marching in at the head of a huge force, and he would either have to prove his loyalty or his battlefield prowess. But just as Nuraddin was about to lead his men, he became very ill, and a few days later, on May 15, 1174, he died in Damascus. And his heir, by the way, was only 11 years old. Ah, opportunity. Saladin rushed to Damascus under the premise of paying respects to his sovereign. He arrived in the city in November of 1174 and was welcomed in by the common people as his virtuous reputation preceded him. Once he got his foot through the gate, he went right to work. He married Nuraddin's widow and declared himself the regent to Nuraddin's young heir. The youth, by the way, would die of disease a few years later, but not all in the Zengid family were happy with this takeover. Thus, Saladin mobilized his army and over the next several months conducted a lightning campaign to bring Syria, or at least most of it, under his control. This would culminate at the Battle of the Horns of Hama on April 13, 1175, where Saladin absolutely crushed a Zengid army. It would not be long after this that he would be recognized by the Caliph as being the Sultan of both Egypt and Syria. James Reston again summarizes the situation really well. Quote, "At the age of 38, Saladin took power in both Damascus and Cairo. Centuries-old divisions evaporated. The Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt was finished, and with its demise, Sunnism of the north supplemented Shiaism along the Nile. Saladin was declared king of Syria and was recognized by the Caliph in Baghdad. Saladin would later proclaim, 'When God gave me the land of Egypt, I was sure that he meant Palestine for me as well.'" The dream of a united front against the Christians was a reality at last. That dream was the Christian nightmare. For 90 years, through skillful alliances and offensives, destabilizing raids and strategic castles, the Latin kingdom had kept its enemies off balance. The survival of the Latin kingdom would now depend on its internal discipline and its military skill. End quote. In the very same year that Saladin had seized the throne of Syria, 1174, the rather belligerent King Amalric of Jerusalem died of dysentery. He was succeeded by King Baldwin IV, who at the time was in his early teens and afflicted with leprosy. When the Sultan had better secured his hold over Syria by beating back the Zengid dynasty, he sensed a ripe opportunity to attack and to pay back the Crusaders for staging multiple raids into his territory. Saladin marshaled his forces and invaded the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1177, but Baldwin IV proved he was both an intelligent and effective leader. Saladin may have had a larger force, but he made a rare mistake of underestimating his enemy and dispersed his troops. The young king, despite being outnumbered, managed to catch Saladin by surprise through deft maneuvering. On November 25, 1177, Baldwin IV won a spectacular victory and crushed the Muslim army at the Battle of Montesquieu. Saladin was nearly killed in the fray, and only through sheer luck did he make it back to Cairo, but he left his army devastated behind him. However, the Sultan was not done. He would rally his men, and over the next 3 years would continue to fight and would win several victories over the Latins. Eventually, in 1180, both sides were exhausted with war, and in the setting of a severe drought, agreed to a 2-year truce. But this peace would be precarious at best, and when it ended, hostilities began almost immediately. In 1183, Saladin managed to take Aleppo. This victory made him arguably the most powerful man in the Levant, and gave him the initiative to attack the Crusader states from along the entire front with Syria and also from Egypt. It was only the resolve of the Crusader High Command that kept the Sultan's attacks in check, but this too would not last. In 1185, Baldwin IV died. Before he passed, he was able to secure a 4-year truce with the Sultan. Saladin, who was dealing with the last Zengid stronghold in Mosul, readily agreed. But Baldwin IV didn't have a direct heir. He was succeeded by his nephew Baldwin V, who was only a child and died the next year. Therefore, the throne of Jerusalem would go to Baldwin's sister Sibylla, who shortly thereafter crowned her husband, Guy of Lusignan. Guy was the son of a minor lord in western France. He was banished from his land at an early age and took to crusading more to escape than for religious obligation. But the man had an eye for opportunity, and in 1180 he married Sibylla, which turned out to be a good move. A mere 6 years later, he found himself King of Jerusalem, and this just in time to face the gathering storm of an all-out war that would soon be upon him. When we last left Raynald de Chatillon, he was groveling at the feet of Emperor Manuel I Komnenos. If you recall, this was in Antioch in 1159 after his barbarous raid of Byzantine Cyprus. Some people would perhaps at this point rethought their actions, but this man didn't. The very next year, while raiding again, this time in the Anti-Taurus Mountains, he was captured by Nuraddin's men and thrown into prison in Aleppo, where he'd reside for the next 16 years. Now, little is known of his time in imprisonment, but it's probably safe to say that he nursed his hatred of all things Muslim. After being released, he made his way to Jerusalem, where he began to make allies quickly. He was King Baldwin's second in command at the Battle of Montesgard, where Saladin's impressive army was annihilated. Raynald gained the reputation of being a fierce warrior and would bring the fight to his enemies. In 1183, he even built a fleet of ships to raid Muslim ports in the Red Sea with the intent to attack Mecca and burn the Kaaba to the ground. However, he really wouldn't come close. His fleet was eventually destroyed by Saladin's navy. Later, from a political standpoint, Raynald would become one of the biggest supporters of Guy of Lusignan's ascension. He obviously backed the right horse. Guy would become king, and Raynald found himself lord of one of the most formidable castles in the Crusader kingdom, the fortress of Kerak. The fortress was nearly impregnable. It had been besieged numerous times, but to little avail. And as it turned out, it was the perfect spot to retire to after a hard day of, well, raiding and pillaging. Strategically, it lay on the pilgrimage route between Damascus and Mecca, so when Baldwin IV and Saladin agreed to a truce, caravans began to make their way past the imposing Kerak on a regular basis, which was simply too tempting for Raynald to pass up. He broke the peace, attacked the convoys, which in turn incited the anger of the Sultan. Meanwhile, the King of Jerusalem knew that the Crusader states were in a precarious position, being nearly surrounded by the Sultan's empire. Baldwin IV knew that the truce was critical to survival. He severely admonished Raynald for his raids, but this really didn't do much, and when Baldwin IV died, Raynald only intensified his attacks. It was in early 1187 that an especially rich caravan was making its way from Cairo to Damascus. The leader of this convoy had faith in the truce, so the caravan itself was only lightly armed. Thus, when Raynald attacked it, he had no difficulty capturing it. Its riches were confiscated and its people were imprisoned. However, as it would turn out, one of the prisoners that Raynald took that day just happened to be the sister of Saladin. Rested in Warriors of God relates Saladin's response, quote, "When word of this outrage reached Saladin, his fury settled into a smoldering resolve. He sent a message to Chatillon. 'Where are the covenants? Return what you have taken. Chatillon cast aside the message in contempt. The Sultan, in response, renewed his promise that when God put this villain into his hands, he would kill him with those same hands. To the newly crowned king of Jerusalem, meaning Guy of Lusignan, the Sultan protested the outrage. The king was reminded of the truce that had been solemnly struck with his predecessor. He demanded a return of the caravan and all of its wealth, and the release of its prisoners. The Sultan found a receptive audience. Chatillon's actions profoundly shocked the new king, and he insisted that the Prince of Kerak make restitution. But Chatillon refused to surrender his spoils. He responded by saying, "Just as he is the lord of his land, I am the lord of my land. I have no truce with the Arabs." And thus, with that one action, the fragile Latin kingdom of Jerusalem was divided, and the powerful Sultan was provoked. Chatillon's treachery had elevated Saladin's prestige throughout his empire and had made his cause righteous. A chain reaction had begun. End quote. From across his vast empire, now known as the Ayyubid, Saladin assembled his army. In May of 1187, he attacked and destroyed a crusader force at the Battle of Cresson. The Latin knights fell for a classic feigned retreat, and nearly the entire force was wiped out. This would be a decisive Ayyubid victory, but it would pale in comparison to what would happen next. In the heat of the summer of 1187, Saladin attacked again, bringing in an estimated 30,000 men. His plan was to lure the Crusaders into a fight on ground of his choosing. The Latin knights, on the other hand, had scored a settle after their defeat at Cresson. Saladin deployed his scouts and determined the location of his enemy. Once he found them, he set up a means to lure them in. He laid siege to the city of Tiberias, which he would later take. When the king of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, heard about the fall of Tiberias, he marched his best troops right in. And it should be mentioned that these troops marked the bulk of what the Crusader states actually had. However, Guy of Lusignan, going against some of his own counsel's advice, rashly moved his men through arid lands that simply didn't have enough water. In his haste to attack the Muslims, he didn't even give his men enough time to replenish with the little water that they found. Dehydration would set in quickly, slowing his advance. The Sultan, meanwhile, kept his men back and well supplied. Saladin would later send in his horse archers to harass the Crusader column, and at night, raids were deployed to deprive Guy and his men of sleep. To make the situation even worse, the Sultan would set dry grass ablaze to produce smoke in order to choke the Latin host. On July 4th, 1187, Saladin sensed it was the right time to attack. On the slopes of an extinct volcano with twin peaks, known as the Horns of Hattin, Saladin managed to achieve complete encirclement of the exhausted and dehydrated Crusaders. That day, he won his masterpiece victory, known as the Battle of Hattin. He demolished the flower of the Crusader states and captured its king. When the battle was over, he brought Guy of Lusignan and Raynald de Chatillon before him. To the king of Jerusalem, he offered amnesty, giving him a cup of iced rosewater. But for Raynald de Chatillon, this would be his last day. It was later recorded that Saladin offered Raynald the chance to convert, and when this was refused, the Sultan, true to his word, drew his sword and beheaded Raynald on the spot. The army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was now eliminated. The Crusader states were now essentially helpless. Though they still possessed a bunch of cities, fortresses, and castles, there simply was not enough manpower left to defend them. Saladin's next move was clear. He captured a bunch of Crusader territory in order to complete an encirclement of what was to be his greatest prize. It was now time for the city of Jerusalem itself to come under a powerful siege by the Sultan and his Ayyubid army. The siege began on September 20th, 1187, just a few months after the Battle of Hattin. In what would be a last-ditch effort, the meager defenses of the city were strengthened by Balian of Ibelin, Balian had been in charge of the rear guard at the Battle of Hattin, but had managed to escape the carnage. However, once in charge of the city, he put up an intense defense that dragged on for 2 weeks. His resolve exhausted the Sultan's army and brought both sides to the negotiating table. James Reston explains how this all went down. Quote, Balian was advised to sue for peace. He sent an emissary to Saladin stating his readiness to talk. At first, Saladin was uninterested. My wise men say that Jerusalem can only be cleansed with Christian blood, he said bitterly. Then he reminded the ambassadors of what had happened 88 years before. My counsel tells me to take revenge for the Muslims whom Godfrey slew in the streets and even in the temple. Thus, a second embassy was sent and turned away, and finally a third came, led by Balian himself to plead with Saladin to name his own conditions for the surrender. In return for the city, Balian asked amnesty for the people of Jerusalem, to which Saladin growled, Neither amnesty nor mercy for you. Tomorrow will make us your masters. We shall kill and capture you and reduce the poor and the women to slavery. At this terrifying threat, Balian kept his wits and delivered his counter-threat. If we must despair of your mercy, if we are sure there is no escape, we shall seek death like men. We shall hurl ourselves at you, we shall cast ourselves into the fire. Above all, we shall not dishonor ourselves. No one will be wounded until he has wounded 10 men himself. We will kill every Muslim prisoner in our hands, and we have thousands. We shall tear up the rock and leave you to enjoy the grief of losing it. We will burn the houses and pull down the dome and leave you the shame of reducing us to slavery. Balian then paused for effect. What advantage do you gain from this ungenerous spirit? You, Sultan, stand to lose everything. End quote. Balian was right, and the Sultan knew it. In the end, Saladin offered terms that were generous. These were agreed to, and thus on October 2nd, 1187, the city of Jerusalem, once the capital of the Crusader states, was formally surrendered. With the capture of Jerusalem, Saladin's jihad was complete. His army, however, would not stop there. The rest of the Levant was slowly taken as one Crusader city and stronghold was taken. It was only the city of Tyre which managed to hold out. It became the rally point for what was left of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Saladin would lay siege to the city, but was unable to take it. Eventually, he had more pressing matters in the east to deal with. But leaving Tyre behind would come back to haunt the Sultan. Regardless, Saladin had assured his place in history. James Reston again eloquently brings all of this into perspective. Quote, Saladin remains a preeminent hero of the Islamic world. It was he who united the Arabs, who defeated the Crusaders, who recaptured Jerusalem, and who threw the European invaders out of Arab lands. On the bars of a small dimly lit cell in the old city of Jerusalem, where Saladin lived humbly after his grand conquests, is the inscription, Allah Muhammad Salahaddin, God, Prophet, Liberator. Such is Saladin's relation to the Muslim God. End quote. If the fall of Edessa had taken Europe as a shock, the fall of Jerusalem would rock it to its very core. When the Byzantine Empire heard of the defeat of their co-religionists, there was unfortunately very little that they could do. As mentioned before, with the death of Manuel I Komnenos in 1180, the Komnenian Restoration would effectively come to an end. In 1183, the government would be taken by Andronicus I Komnenos in a coup. The man had absolutely no love for Western Europe and its culture, a far cry from his predecessor. His reign began with a massacre of the Latins that were living in Constantinople. Again, many of those that were slaughtered were Venetians, something, by the way, that Venice would not easily forget. Andronicus employed harsh measures, and to his credit, he was able to severely curb corruption. But his hardline approach spilled over into tyranny. The man gained the reputation of using extreme and bizarre cruelty to keep his people in line. As the years progressed, it was whispered that his mind was eroding, he was becoming mad, and the latter part of his rule became a reign of terror. Finally, in 1185, his people had had enough and rose up in rebellion. The emperor was captured as he attempted to flee the city. In the end, he reaped what he sowed. He was publicly tortured for 3 days, before being hung upside down in the hippodrome, and 2 Latin soldiers bayoneted him with their swords till he died. From that moment onwards, the Eastern Empire began to fragment and descend into a new dark age. Byzantium would now have to sit on the sidelines, but in Western Europe, the response to the fall of Jerusalem would be met very differently. On October 29, 1187, Pope Gregory VIII would issue a papal bull calling for a new crusade to fight the Ayyubid Sultan. The response was once again very impressive. Frederick Barbarossa, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, mobilized a vast army and began to march. Philip II, the King of France, also heeded the call, but there was another that took up the cross as well. The King of England had also committed to the cause. He was known as Richard I. He would prove to be a master of warfare, a true contender for the great Sultan of the East. His battlefield exploits would gain him the name the Lionheart. The stage was now set for 2 of the greatest generals in history to go head-to-head. The Third Crusade had begun. Near the western coast of France, about 80 miles north of Bordeaux, lies the fortress of Taillebourg. It was built from the ground up to be unconquerable. Its position high on a cliff was unapproachable from 3 sides. The fourth side had a triple wall with a triple trench, and it bristled with redundant strongpoints and fortifications. This was a Kobayashi Maru, a no-win scenario for anyone who was foolish enough to attempt to take it by force. Many had tried, only to walk away with a new lesson in humility. But then, in 1179, a new challenger arrived. His name, by the way, was Richard. In his life, he would gain many names. Among them was Richard I, also known as, well, the King of England. He was born in 1157, son to King Henry II of England, and the favorite to the Crusader Queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, from whom he would receive the DNA of crusading fervor. From an early age, he showed great skill in politics and all things military. He was renowned for his courage and his sense of chivalry. He was going to really need this. Growing up in the tumultuous environment of Western Europe, his life would be dedicated to war. He learned quickly that to accomplish an objective would sometimes require absolute brutality, yet his mind possessed a rare gift of military brilliance. His ability in both grand strategy and battlefield tactics was far beyond his time. As Richard gazed upon the great fortress that now lay before him, he knew that an extended siege would only deplete his men and resources. However, his keen mind, like many outstanding generals in history, had already learned that brute force paled in comparison to the power of subterfuge, movement, and audacity which served as a force multiplier. Furthermore, if he was going to fight, he would be the one to choose the method in which it would be executed. Thus, he sent his men out to scavenge the surrounding countryside for spoils, but he made them use a scorched earth tactic. Every day, the defenders of Taillebourg would watch their countryside being ravaged in flame. Richard could have cared less for the spoils that he procured. This was not really his goal. Rather, he guessed, correctly I might add, that the defenders were getting complacent in their strong defensive positions and would be quick to anger at the carnage they were now forced to watch. Richard, meanwhile, put on a show of deception, only lighting a few campfires at night, concealing his men, and always made them ride single file to hide their numbers. It worked. The defenders opened their gates and launched a counterattack into what they thought was a desperate opponent. But this was exactly what Richard was hoping for. He had set up an ambush, routed the incoming attack, and then chased the retreating men back through the open gates of their own fortress. Within 2 days, Richard was the master of the fortress of Trelleborg. He had won the no-win scenario. As James Reston in his book Warriors of God would say, his reputation grew to continental proportions. Now with this victory, the nobles of Aquitaine fell into line as nobody wanted to mess with such a powerful and cunning warrior. Indeed, his French campaigns would even cause some to claim that the man had the heart of a lion. Go figure. His exploits were gaining him a fierce reputation. But for Richard, this would be nothing more than a warm-up. Western Europe at this time was heavily divided. France was ruled by the Capetian dynasty, and England was under the Angevins. Henry II had taken Normandy and then acquired Aquitaine after marrying Eleanor, who was previously married to the French king, Louis VII. Though the Angevins were technically vassals to the French Capetians, they were now more powerful, which was both awkward and would lead to years of warfare. However, there was considerable discord within the Angevins themselves, as Henry II, Richard, and almost all of his brothers would almost consistently be fighting one another in a dizzying array of shifting alliances. Richard at one point would be at his father's feet, begging for forgiveness, and a few years later be trying to overthrow him. Henry II, on several different occasions, came very close to disowning Richard altogether, and as Henry's animosity grew, he even put his eldest son and heir, also named Henry, to the task of bringing Richard down. But in 1183, that would all change. James Reston explains, quote, Richard's older brother Henry took ill in June of 1183 and died. In one swoop, Henry II's plans were dashed. His heir was gone. The insurgents of Aquitaine had lost their champion, and the villain himself, the independent, indomitable, ruthless Richard, now stood as Henry's eldest son and heir to the English throne. End quote. But make no mistake, this by no means would cease hostilities between father and son. In fact, it would take something really big to even have a chance to disrupt their ongoing struggle. And this is where fate would intervene, far to the east in the embattled Holy Land of the Levant. Syria and Egypt had been unified into a powerful empire known as the Ayyubid by the Sultan al-Nasir Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, but he was also known as Saladin. In early July of 1187, the Sultan had crushed the army of Jerusalem at the Battle of Hattin, and a few months later, in October, had captured Jerusalem itself. After this, he would go on to essentially destroy most of the Crusader kingdom. News of this disaster shocked Western Europe, and in November of 1187, Pope Gregory VIII announced a new crusade to recapture the Holy City and drive the great Sultan from what had once been the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The call to crusade was in Richard's blood. That, and of course, an insatiable appetite for glory. He was among the very first to take up the cross, which he did in December of 1187, and this in turn would put considerable peer pressure on the kings of England and France to do likewise. Indeed, on January 21st, 1188, the kings of England and France met at the city of Gisors and announced their commitment to the crusade. By the way, it was here that the idea of a Saladin tax or tithe to pay for the campaign was created, with the added caveat that if you went on crusade, you didn't have to pay the tax, which would turn out to be an excellent tool for recruitment. However, negotiations during this conference would break down and the details of logistics would never be worked out. This did not deter Richard for a bit. His yearning to go east was as vibrant as ever. But before he could go on crusade, he would still have to deal with the ongoing war with his own father. and to do this, he would require an ally. Philip II, who would be known as Philip Augustus, was the son of the French Crusader king Louis VII. In 1179, Louis had an attack of paralysis and feared for his own death, which prompted him to crown his son, who was only 15. On November 1st, 1179, Philip, that is, Philip Augustus, if you please, became the next king of the Capetian dynasty. 11 months later, Louis died in 1180, making Philip the sole ruler of France. The man would have his hands full from the get-go, as the ongoing conflict between England and France would persist. Thus, after the Conference of Gisors in 1188 had broken down, Philip saw an opportunity with Richard to strike at the English king and to possibly destabilize the Angevin dynasty in the process. Richard and Philip made an alliance, combined their forces, and fought Henry II across Normandy and deep into France. The aging and vulnerable Henry II was no match. His son's onslaught, backed up by the French king, was simply too much. In early July of 1189, after being repeatedly defeated, Henry II had to come to terms. He announced Richard as his heir, before his health completely failed him on July 6th. James Reston describes his final scene, quote, "Richard knelt by his father's deathbed and wept, for he was not proud of his hostile actions against his own father, and they would haunt him for the rest of his life." Henry was unmoved. He turned his head to his son and spewed out his last venom. "God grant that I may not die until I have had a fitting revenge on you." This was the last gasp of a dying man. He was carried off, where he passed away a few days later. Later, Richard appeared at the funeral and was overcome with grief and guilt. It was said by a chronicler that when the son approached his father, blood burst from the nostrils of the corpse. This was a sinister and terrifying miracle which suggested that Richard had somehow killed his own father. End quote. After the death of his father, Richard briefly traveled to England. In Westminster on September 3rd, 1189, he was crowned Richard I, King of England. From that moment onwards, he dedicated himself heart and soul into the monstrous task of organizing the crusade. The Saladin tithe was imposed, horses from all over the realm were procured, ships built, and an army raised. Being the astute general that he was, Richard painstakingly prepared and then prepared again. After all, he knew that all war was governed by the ironclad rule of logistics, and he planned accordingly. To support his cause, vast sums of money were raised. It was even remarked that the English king would have sold London if only he could find a buyer. Philip II did likewise and mobilized an impressive army as well. In early July of 1190, nearly a year to the day of Henry II's death, the two kings and their impressive armies set out from the city of Vézelay. But just as resplendent as they were, discord was noted. A contemporary chronicler would lament, quote, "That immense army glowed with ardor and combined military discipline and goodwill. It could have been invincible to all the world. But it was riven with disputes and undermined by internal discord. Ties of fellowship were violated, and a house divided against itself is made desolate." End quote. The English fleet sailed from Dartmouth, while Richard and his army made their way south to where the men spoke Italian. Eventually, after some delay, they all arrived at Messina in Sicily, where he met up with Philip. But these two Crusader kings would not be alone. Another powerful ruler had also taken up the cross. Frederick Barbarossa was a veteran of the Second Crusade, as he had accompanied his uncle, the German king Conrad III. In Asia Minor, he witnessed how powerful a Seljuk attack could be, and at the walls of Damascus, he watched as the Second Crusade failed. He had absolutely no intention of repeating those mistakes. To his credit, Barbarossa was both an impressive military commander and a clever ruler. This man had the diplomatic finesse of an Otto von Bismarck, the tactical skill of a Frederick the Great, and the strategic insight of an Erich von Manstein. When he became Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 1155, he had to aggressively exploit these abilities. The Holy Roman Empire was a massive domain, but heavily fractured and prone to repeated rebellion. However, Barbarossa campaigned for decades and managed to unite the empire as never before. Thus, when the Third Crusade was preached in 1187, he was in a position that he could go east. He waited at first to see what his colleagues in the west would do. And then on May 27, 1188, he declared his intentions to go on crusade and then set out at the head of a grand army that was well provisioned and guided with German efficiency. Now, it should be noted that more than a decade before this happened, he had made a treaty of friendship with Saladin. His honor as a warrior, however, mandated that he gave the Sultan fair warning of his approach. It was even recorded what he said, quote, "Now that you have profaned the Holy Land, we will proceed with due vigor against such presumptuous and criminal audacity. Restore the land which you have seized. We shall give you a period of 12 months, after which you shall experience the fortune of war. The youth of the Danube, who know not how to flee, the towering Bavarian, the cunning Swabian, the fiery Burgundian, you, God willing, shall learn the might of our victorious eagles, and shall experience the anger of Germany." End quote. Barbarossa's army, according to some sources, which could be exaggerated, was estimated to be 100,000 strong. This absolutely sent chills into Saladin, who began to pull men from other fronts, including the Siege of Acre, more on that in a bit, to confront this striking new threat. The Germans made their way across Romania and Hungary without incident. It was only when they reached the Byzantine Empire that they met resistance. The Eastern Roman Emperor had made an alliance with Saladin to block Frederick's passage. But this didn't even begin to deter Barbarossa, who blitzed his way across the Balkans, taking out Byzantine strongpoints and cities along the way. By October of 1189, the German emperor stood before Constantinople itself. He then used gunboat diplomacy to achieve an agreement with the Byzantine and crossed into Asia Minor at the Hellespont in February of 1190. Over the next few months, Barbarossa drove his army east, his forces clashing with the Seljuk repeatedly. The Seljuk were able at times to inflict serious casualties. But the Germans were able to give as well as receive. In May of 1190, they routed a major Seljuk army, and later in that same month, they were able to take the Seljuk capital of Iconium, stripping it of its treasury. The Seljuk would pull back as the German host made its way into Armenian Cilicia, but here disaster would strike. The tale of what happened next is described in the book Warriors of God. Quote, "On June 10, 1190, under the terrible heat of the dusty plain, the German crusaders began to ford a small Cilician river called the Salif, also known as the Iron River, on their final push into Syria. Broiling in his iron suit of armor, the emperor was barking orders in the shallow river amid a team of horses when suddenly the great beast and then his own horse spooked. The emperor was thrown into the water. Even though the river was no more than hip deep, the weight of his armor pulled the emperor down. In the shock of the cold water gushing through the crevices of his armor plate across his overheated skin, he had a heart attack and drowned. The consequence of the emperor's death was catastrophic. His army was thrown into chaos and disintegrated almost immediately. Seeing their opportunity, the Turks attacked from all sides. and the leaderless German soldiers melted into the countryside. Out of the nearly 100,000 men who had made their way through Byzantium, only about 5,000 eventually limped into Acre weeks later. End quote. For the German emperor, his army, and perhaps even for the entire Third Crusade, June 10th was perhaps not a good day to die. The German contingent was essentially no more, but far to the west, Richard and Philip were still on their way. The King of England and the King of France arrived in the city of Messina in Sicily in September of 1190. There they would remain for several months, as the new King of Sicily, a man named Tancred, proved to be quite hostile. He had come to power the year before and had imprisoned the former King of Sicily's wife, a woman named Joan of England. She just happened to be Richard's sister, and if there is ever a lesson to be learned in crusading history, you don't mess with somebody's family, especially if they are the king or the sultan. It didn't take long for Richard to subdue the island and put down any rebellion, but by then the sailing season had passed. The next several months on the island were difficult for both Richard and Philip. Animosity between them grew considerably. Eventually, it led to direct confrontation between the two kings, but in time they were able to come to some sort of agreement. It was decided that they would both continue on crusade, but Richard would no longer be marrying Philip's sister. Instead, Richard would now be betrothed to Berengaria of Navarre. But make no mistake, the compromise left both men with resentment. James Reston explains what happened next. Quote, on March 30th, 1191, King Philip of France left Sicily for the Holy Land in a pout. He left precipitously and unceremoniously since he did not want to suffer the embarrassment of encountering Princess Berengaria, who was replacing his half-sister as Richard's betrothed. Regardless of his emotional state, Philip's voyage was smooth and unmarred by mishap, and he arrived at Acre 3 weeks later on April 20th in good spirits. Richard's departure had more fanfare and his voyage more drama. With him would go the bulk of the Crusader fleet, which had swollen to an enormous size over the winter. On April 10th, the immense flotilla moved out to sea, 219 ships in all, setting a course due east. End quote. Richard's fleet sailed directly into a storm. This dispersed his ships. Some were destroyed, others were able to find safe harbor. One portion of the fleet, which carried Richard's sister Joan, his fiancée Berengaria, and most of his treasury, arrived at the city of Limassol in southern Cyprus. Joan and Berengaria were treated exceptionally rude, denied entry into the port, and were not even given fresh water. Richard's treasury, by the way, was also taken. The man responsible was a Byzantine emperor named Isaac Komnenos. He would soon regret these actions. The Byzantine Empire at this time was in a really sad state. Its last golden age, known as the Komnenian Restoration, was over. A dark age had begun and was only getting worse. In 1180, Manuel I Komnenos, the last of the good emperors of the Komnenian Restoration, died. The despotic, xenophobic, some would say mad, Andronicus I Komnenos would seize power a few years later. Andronicus's reign began with a massacre of the Latins that were living in Constantinople. Men, women, and children from the west, numbering in the thousands, were slaughtered in the streets. The rest of Andronicus's time in power would descend into a reign of terror, which culminated with the emperor being executed in the Hippodrome. A new dynasty would come to power in 1185. They were known as the Angelos. John Julius Norwich, in A Short History of Byzantium, lovingly describes them. Quote, of all the families that reigned over Byzantium, the Angeloi were the worst. Their supremacy was mercifully short. The three Angelus emperors, Isaac II, Alexios III, and Alexios IV, altogether reigned only 19 years. But each was disastrous, and together they were responsible for Constantinople's greatest catastrophe. End quote. Isaac Komnenos was Manuel I's brother. Though he was the eldest, he had been passed over for the lead spot. Instead, he served his brother well in administration. But in 1180, he was captured by the Armenians. He was then imprisoned in chains for many years, where he grew hateful and developed a phobia for chains. He was released in 1185, but he knew that he would be a target for the new regime in Constantinople. However, as the Byzantine Empire continued to weaken under the Angeloi Dynasty, Isaac found an opportunity in Cyprus. He took the island, broke off from the Eastern Empire, declared himself his own emperor, and fended off a seaborne attack from Constantinople. From that time onwards, he ruled the island like a vicious tyrant. His people suffered immensely under his rule. On May 6th of 1191, Richard and a good portion of his fleet arrived at the harbor at Limassol. Isaac Komnenos watched the arrival, but he figured he was in a commanding position as he had numerical superiority in terms of troops. Richard was angry at the foul treatment that Isaac had dished out. He demanded the release of any prisoners, the return of his money, and he promised that with that they would simply be on their way. However, Isaac dismissed him, stating to the effect that he was an emperor and would have nothing to do with just a mere king. In retrospect, he might have chosen his words just a bit more carefully. With this response, Richard donned his armor, grabbed his weapon, and on cue his men did likewise. Looking back at his men, the king gave one simple command: "Follow me," and with that the Crusaders made their way ashore. The emperor sent in his more numerous troops, who at first were able to mount a decent defense, but overall they were poorly trained. Richard, on the other hand, with his well-disciplined, more experienced knights, brought their crossbows to bear and began to mow down their opponents without remorse. The Byzantine army broke and then were routed. In fact, Richard attempted to hunt down the emperor on horse, but Isaac Komnenos managed to escape. James Reston explains the pursuit that followed. Quote, "Very early on the following morning, the king and 50 knights trotted out gingerly 5 miles to the east, near a castle called Colossi, where Isaac had regrouped and was ready for a fight. Even in the glow of dawn, with the camp asleep, the local force looked daunting. One company clerk was bold enough to whisper to the king, 'Sire, it appears to be a wise plan to decline a battle with so large and so powerful a multitude.' 'Young man, you best confine yourself to your writing,' the king snapped, 'and leave the war to us.'" End quote. Richard was vastly outnumbered, but what he lacked in manpower he compensated for with the element of surprise. James Reston continues with the king's version of a wake-up call. Quote, "The engagement at Colossi was swift, violent, and short. The charge of the smaller force into the slumbering encampment dispatched the multitude. It was later reported that Richard chased the emperor in all of his imperial nakedness through the war in the tents. However, in whatever undignified state, the emperor managed to hightail it on his magnificent yellow Arabian stallion and fled through the Troodos Mountains towards Nicosia." End quote. With Isaac driven off, Richard returned to Limassol. There he took the castle and converted it into his base of operations while he waited for his fleet to arrive with more reinforcements. On May 11th of 1191, Guy of Lusignan arrived with 160 knights. Guy was now the deposed king of Jerusalem. He was the man who led his army to destruction at the Battle of Hattin in 1187. Saladin had released him in 1189, not so much out of goodwill, but rather to sow political disunity within the Crusader ranks. Guy had come directly from the trenches of the Siege of Acre, which at that time was well into its second year. He explained that Philip Augustus had already arrived and was even then making an alliance with Conrad of Montferrat against him. Conrad, by the way, was the lord and defender of the last Christian stronghold, the city of Tyre, and he was in no mood to share any power with Guy. Thus, Guy of Lusignan needed to counterbalance this threat, so he pledged his loyalty to Richard and urged that he come to the Levant as soon as possible. But Richard still had unfinished business to contend with. The very next day, on May 12, 1191, with his beachhead secured, the English king married Berengaria of Navarre. It was more so a political move to secure his allies back in Western Europe. The emperor, Isaac Komnenos, made a surprise appearance at the wedding and begged the king for forgiveness, which was given. But that very night, Isaac had a change of heart. He fled the royal ceremony to Nicosia, where he declared war against the Latins. Richard, at this point, had had enough. He didn't have time to placate any fool. He needed a decisive move, and his answer was, well, to take the entire island. Richard, first and foremost, divided his navy into two groups. The first group was to sweep around the western part of the island, destroying the emperor's navy and seizing ports along the way. The second part of his navy did exactly the same thing, except around the eastern part of Cyprus, cutting off any path that Isaac may have had to flee. Richard then placed Guy of Lusignan in charge of the army. For the next several days, Richard's army chased the emperor from one of his strong points to the next. The two armies actually met at a pitched battle known as Tremathusa. But this wasn't even a contest. Isaac was defeated and had to run for his life once again. This time it was to his last stronghold, the fortress of Cantara, but even here he wasn't able to hold his ground. At the tip of the Carpus Peninsula, surrounded by Richard's army and navy, Isaac was finally captured. He fell to the king's feet and groveled with everything that he had, begging that no matter what happens, he should never be placed in iron chains again, as his phobia to them was now pathological. Richard agreed, no more iron chains. Instead, he had silver chains created, as probably befitting an emperor, and then sent Isaac back into imprisonment. Isaac Komnenos would be the last Byzantine emperor of Cyprus. In time, Guy of Lusignan would be given the island by Richard, and Guy and his descendants would rule the island for centuries. Cyprus was now a perfect base of operations. It had fertile fields, good cities, and exceptional ports. Indeed, the port city of Famagusta had an excellent harbor and received goods from 3 continents. The island, now secured, would be a constant source of provisions. Logistically, Richard was in a better position than ever before. It was now time for Richard to complete his Crusader oath. On June 5, 1191, his navy and his men embarked from Famagusta. Their destination was the embattled city of Acre. A chronicler of the Third Crusade would describe it as, quote, "If a 10-year war made Troy celebrated, if the triumph of the Christian made Antioch more illustrious, Acre will certainly obtain eternal fame as a city for which the whole world contended." End quote. Acre was in stalemate. For nearly 2 years, the Christian besiegers were unable to take the city, and yet Saladin and his army were unable to dislodge the Crusaders. On June 8, 1191, Richard arrived at the city and was eager to tip the scales of war in his favor. As he came upon the battlefield and assumed command of all forces, the king must have felt some sense of destiny, and perhaps he wasn't alone. The great contest between king and sultan, Richard and Saladin, 2 indomitable men, both masters of war, had now begun. In July of 1187, an Italian ship made its way across the Mediterranean towards the Kingdom of Jerusalem. On the foredeck stood a tall, formidable man gazing at the horizon. He was a nobleman born in northwest Italy to a family renowned for their fortitude on the battlefield. He himself was no stranger to war. Since a youth, he was trained in combat, and he had fought alongside his siblings on several campaigns. Eventually, he came into the employment of the Byzantine Emperor Isaac II Angelos. Though he had distinguished himself in imperial service, he felt that his compensation was lacking. What's more, his brother had died under somewhat dubious circumstances in Constantinople just a few years prior. His relations with the Byzantine dramatically soured. He became a wanted man. He was embroiled in conspiracy and dubbed by some to be a murderer. As he was recently widowed, he decided to leave the Eastern Roman Empire behind and join his father in the Holy Land to seek a new fortune. This man's name was Conrad of Montferrat. He was known for his intelligence, his skill as a warrior, and in time, for his absolute ruthlessness. In mid-July of 1187, his ship came into sight to the city of Acre. But he could tell right away that something was wrong. The church bells were not ringing. So instead of sailing into the great harbor of the city, a scout was deployed to find out what had happened. From the scout, Conrad learned of the disaster of the Battle of Hattin. He learned that the army of Jerusalem was destroyed, King Guy captured, and the Sultan, Saladin, had moved quickly to take many cities. Sidon, Beirut, and even Acre, which had fallen only a few days prior to his arrival. However, despite this devastating news, he also ascertained that the city of Tyre remained in Crusader hands, and that would be his next destination. He traveled north and arrived at Tyre just in the nick of time. The shattered forces of the Kingdom of Jerusalem had rallied to the city, but were in a state of panic. Conrad assumed command. He went to work fortifying the city and organizing the scattered and broken Crusaders into nothing less than a viciously effective defense. When Saladin arrived, he expected yet another easy victory. Instead, he met stout resistance led by the Marquis de Montferrat. Realizing this, the Sultan brought forth Conrad's father and offered him as a bargaining chip if the city was to capitulate. From his ramparts, Conrad bellowed his response. "Tie him to a stake! What do I care? I shall be the first to shoot him, for he is old and worthless." At which point the Marquis pulled out a crossbow and took a shot at his own father. This both horrified and impressed Saladin, who realized that negotiation was not going to work with this man. A full-blown siege with multiple assaults on the city followed, but failed. This would inspire a Muslim chronicler, Ibn al-Athir, to comment that Conrad was a devil incarnate in his ability to defend a town and a man of extraordinary courage. The Sultan decided that he had more pressing issues. After all, the city of Jerusalem was now surrounded and was ripe for conquest. Leaving Tyre behind, however, would be a mistake that Saladin would soon regret. After Jerusalem fell in early October of 1187, Saladin returned to Tyre. Reston in Warriors of God covers it well. Quote, "In November of 1187, the Sultan moved on Tyre for the second time. If he was able to capture this last vestige now, he would literally succeed in throwing the Christians into the sea. Since Saladin's first assault earlier in that year, the able renegade Conrad of Montferrat had been able to strengthen Tyre's defenses considerably. Christian refugees continued to stream into the enclave from Jerusalem and other captured places. The city was veritably bursting at the seams with the beneficiaries of Saladin's tender and ill-advised charity." End quote. Saladin knew that only a combined ground and naval assault could take Tyre. His men surrounded the city, dug entrenchments, and began to build siege towers. An Egyptian fleet was deployed to blockade the harbor. However, Conrad reversed the situation completely. During a daring night raid on December 30th, he sent in some of his elite soldiers, basically medieval Navy SEALs. They left the guarded harbor of Tyre, found, and then boarded some of the Egyptian ships, taking the Muslim sailors by surprise.
the inexperienced crews panicked. They ran overboard and then swam for their lives. These ships were towed into the harbor, quickly manned, and then the combined force launched an all-out attack on the Sultan's remaining ships. For Saladin, it was a complete fiasco. His navy was neutralized. The Sultan decided to cut his losses. In early 1188, he moved on. His vast empire, after all, had enemies on other fronts. The defenders at Tyre, meanwhile, were jubilant. Conrad was a hero. The Sultan now needed a new strategy. Guy of Lusignan had been Saladin's prisoner since the Battle of Hattin. His kingdom of Jerusalem now only existed in his mind. The Sultan figured he was harmless. He should have thought harder. Guy, after all, being of the race of men, above all else, desired power. Saladin figured he could use this motivation to his benefit and released him, figuring his presence would undermine Conrad's authority. The Sultan, however, did make Guy promise never to raise arms again and eventually leave the Holy Land. Guy was set loose and immediately broke his promise. He appeared before Tyre demanding the city. He was, after all, king. Conrad would have nothing to do with the man and barred him entry. Guy, however, was not done yet. As reinforcements came into the city from the west, he lured them to his side. By summer of 1189, he had the loyalty of 700 knights, the backing of the Templars, and an army of 9,000 men. It would seem that the Sultan had made another mistake, and this was quickly realized as Guy marched his new army south. In August of 1189, he arrived at Acre. Acre was one of the most important cities in the Levant, a bustling cosmopolitan town with a thriving market and an impressive port that made it one of the most vital gateways to the Holy Land. Guy moved his army right in and settled down for a siege. Saladin was fighting on multiple fronts, but he deployed a portion of his army to relieve the city, but by the time they got there, it was too late. The Crusaders had created a double entrenchment, one facing the city and the other protecting their rear. They had become besiegers and besieged alike. Both sides then brought in reinforcements, fresh Crusaders arriving by sea and the Sultan's men from the lands of his empire. Over the next several months, well into October, a massive tug-of-war ensued, one attack followed by counterattack. Christian and Muslim casualties were extensive, but the battle lines were set, and each month the fortifications only got stronger. It had become stalemate, and a prolonged one at that. Indeed, the Siege of Acre would be one of the longest in crusading history. James Reston summarizes it really well. Quote, in 1191, as Richard the Lionheart of England and Philip Augustus of France arrived in Sicily for the trip to the Holy Land, they knew this. Tyre remained in Christian hands as a toehold, but its arrogant lord, the Marquis of Montferrat, could not be counted upon for his support. Frederick Barbarossa was dead and his army had dissolved in Asia Minor. For nearly a year and a half, Acre had been under siege, but the siege's commander was the weak King Guy, whose legitimacy was undermined by his poor judgment and incompetence. End quote. The Crusader High Command at this point was heavily divided. When Philip Augustus, the King of France, arrived at Acre on April 20th, 1191, he sensed the political discord immediately. Guy of Lusignan's wife, Sibylla, who was the Queen Regent of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, had died the year before. She just happened to be Guy's only legitimate claim to the throne. Sensing an opportunity, Conrad of Montferrat quickly married Sibylla's sister, putting him in line as the next king of Jerusalem. Philip Augustus thought this over for a bit, and in the end decided to back up Conrad. Guy, meanwhile, looking for new allies, traveled to Cyprus to meet up with Richard. When he arrived, he pledged his loyalty to the English king. The division lines were thus set, Philip and Conrad, and Guy and Richard. But despite this divisiveness, Philip was still able to advance the siege. By May of 1191, the Crusaders had sealed off the city. The land entrenchments now spanned over 2 miles, and the Latin navy provided a very effective blockade of the harbor. Richard, meanwhile, had been delayed on Cyprus, but not wanting to miss out on any potential for glory in the Holy Land, he decided to, quickly capture the whole island. And on June 5th, 1191, his contingent departed from Famagusta. His first order of business was to alleviate the Siege of Acre. Richard first stopped in Tyre and was banned by Conrad from entering the city, so be it, he decided to move south. On June 7th, his fleet came upon a behemoth of a ship. The thing was huge, 3 masts, multiple levels, and hiding in the fog. The English king quickly figured out that this was a relief ship sent by Saladin. It was loaded with provisions and elite troops, enough to keep the garrison at Acre going for months. When discovered, the Leviathan attempted to escape, at which point Richard scolded his men, saying, "Will you allow this ship to get away untouched and uninjured? Shame, you have become cowards from too much sloth. Too many victories over weak foes. The whole world knows you are in the service of the cross." At this admonishment, his troops surged forward and launched a frenzied attack. When the sun set that day, Saladin's ship and his hope to resupply his garrison sunk into the waves. When the Sultan learned of the loss of this immense vessel, he lamented, "O God, I have now lost Acre." Richard arrived the next day on June 8, 1191, and assumed command of all Crusader forces. From that moment onwards, he never let up. In fact, at one point, the English king came down with a terrible fever, but demanded his men put him on a royal stretcher. He was then paraded around while using a crossbow to pick off Acre's defenders. Over the next month, the siege continued. Richard brought in more reinforcements from the sea. Massive catapults and siege towers were constructed. Bombardment of the walls intensified, and then breaches began to open up. Saladin also brought in more of his army and would respond by launching attacks against the Crusaders from their other front, distracting them long enough to allow the garrison of Acre to rebuild some of their fortifications. But Richard knew it was only a matter of time before they would simply be starved out. Indeed, on July 7th, the Muslim garrison sent a desperate appeal to Saladin for help, which the Sultan was simply unable to answer. But to their credit, after nearly 2 years of siege and after loss of their supply and reinforcement, the Muslim defenders of Acre fought one last grave battle to break out on July 11th, but it would fail. The Crusader position was now too strong. And thus, the very next day, on July 12, 1191, Acre fell. Richard had won the first round. Conrad of Montferrat had left the siege of Acre kind of in a pouty way when he realized that Richard had backed up Guy of Lusignan as the next king of Jerusalem. He was asked by both sides to come back to head negotiations for the release of the Muslim garrison, which happened to be approximately 2,700 men. Saladin now knew he was not dealing with an inept leader like Guy of Lusignan. He needed time to bring in more of his army. The Sultan purposely stalled negotiations in an attempt to buy this time. Richard, on the other hand, had already packed up his siege engines and was preparing the next portion of his campaign. The problem were his prisoners of war. They were an encumbrance to movement. Both the Sultan and the king knew this. So, as the talks dragged on into early August, Richard had had enough. He threatened to execute all of his prisoners. Saladin didn't budge, and in my mind, I like to think he was trying to call Richard's bluff. I mean, after all, no man can be that barbaric, right? On August 22, 1191, Saladin got his answer. The Crusader king ordered his prisoners to be tied together, paraded to the middle ground within sight of both armies. And then, one by one, along the road to Nazareth, all 2,700 men were beheaded. Saladin did likewise with his prisoners that he held in Damascus. and all across the Ayyubid Empire, other Christian prisoners faced torture and persecution. The Third Crusade had now leveled up to a new era of atrocity. The time had arrived for Richard to move on, but even before the massacre at Acre, he had to contend with problems within his own ranks. Philip Augustus was losing his nerve for war in the Holy Land. Richard was being cast as the hero, and Philip felt as if he was playing second string. The rivalry between the two kings had not abated since Sicily, when Richard decided not to marry Philip's sister. Not to mention the quarrel on who should be the next king of Jerusalem only intensified their animosity. What's more, King Philip became ill several times. By the records, it would seem that dysentery was the main cause, which, to be fair, would make anybody lose their enthusiasm. On July 22nd, just 10 days after the fall of Acre, Philip announced his intention to return to France. A delegation was sent to the English king asking for pardon to leave. Richard advised against this, but Philip was not deterred. Reston explains, quote, "On July 29, 1191, a week after his shocking notice of betrayal, Philip again sought Richard's official blessing to leave. Having no choice, and perhaps glad to be shed of his faint-hearted companion, Richard could only extract a promise. Under no circumstance was the French king to do harm to any of Richard's land in Europe. Thus disgraced, reviled, and considerably poorer than he had been just a few days before, the King of France skulked out of the Holy Land with 5 ships, 2 of which had to be borrowed from Richard." End quote. Of the 3 kings who had ventured out from their homeland to bring war to Saladin, only Richard now remained. The English king's mind went to work taking in the grand strategic situation. Saladin, on one end, had plentiful resources at his disposal in terms of manpower and material, but he didn't have command of the sea. The Sultan had also adopted a scorched earth policy in order to deprive Richard of any potential resources. He'd even gone so far as to level several coastal cities, including Haifa and Caesarea. Meanwhile, Richard needed to expand his beachhead. His first order of duty was to rebuild Acre. The city's fortifications were restored, and the port once again bristled with activity as more supplies were brought in. Richard then took the time to train and reorganize his men. In line with his character, he even held a jousting tournament. When he felt ready, he and his army moved out, under the close scrutiny of Saladin's scouts. They reported to the Sultan that the Crusader army moved cautiously, taking their time, keeping formation, stopping at rivers to replenish their water, and making it a point to rest. All the while, the King's Great Armada provided naval support, which negated Saladin's policy of destroying all the crops. Within 15 days, the army had moved just 60 miles to the south, within range of the old Crusader fortress of Arsuf. This was going to be a serious problem for Saladin. If Richard could not be stopped here, he could take Jaffa just 6 miles to the south. Jaffa was a major port, which brought in supplies directly to Jerusalem. Thus, with the city under Crusader control, Richard would finally have the ability to move inland on Jerusalem itself. Saladin decided to act. Just north of Arsuf was a wooded region, one of the few in Palestine. It was bordered by a small river known as the River of Reeds. This was a perfect place for an ambush. On September 3rd, Richard's army arrived at the forest. The Sultan maneuvered his men in for the kill, but just before hostilities broke out, a delegation arrived at the Sultan's camp, wanting to talk. Saladin took this seriously. He deployed his brother to handle the negotiations. But the talks faltered, and it soon became clear to the Sultan that this was all a ruse in order to give Richard time to move. While the negotiations were going on, the English king had moved his army beyond the River of Reeds, through the forest, and was even then on the march south. Richard was making his way towards the relative safety of Arsuf. but his army was at that point traversing a large open field flanked by hills and woods to the east. As expected, Saladin was beyond ticked off. He didn't want to waste any more time. On September 7th, 1191, he sent his army in. The Crusader army was estimated to be about 11,000 strong. The Muslim force outnumbered them and was estimated to be about 25,000. Richard maneuvered his men nearly on the coastline on his march south in order to protect his right flank. He then deployed his men into 3 lines. The baggage train was closest to the coast, along with his archers and crossbowmen. The next line was his heavy cavalry, with the Templars and his own native warriors taking up the vanguard, and the Hospitallers defending the rear. The final line, which was furthest from the coast, consisted of his heavy infantry. They were deployed in such a way that they would be essentially facing perpendicular to the line of march. This way they would create a solid wall against an attack coming from the land, basically a long shield of men. Saladin took a position in the center of his men on the wooded hills overlooking the coast. He allowed Richard and his men to march a few miles down the road, hoping that the heat of the day would fatigue the Crusaders. Then, with a single command, he unleashed a portion of his cavalry which poured out of the high ground. Estimated to be over 10,000 horsemen strong, it was a well-coordinated charge that came down to Richard's army and slammed into his infantry. The main point of impact came on the rear of Richard's line. This forced the infantry and the mounted Hospitallers to be compressed into a smaller and smaller space. An eyewitness at the time would lament, "Our people, so few in numbers, were hemmed in by the multitude of the Arabs. They had no means of escape even if they had wanted one. They were shut in like a flock of sheep in the jaws of wolves, with nothing but the sky above and the enemy all around." The Muslims continued to press the attack, but the well-armored Crusader infantry made progress difficult. Instead, Saladin's men would target the Crusaders' horses, hoping to decrease any potential for counterattack. Saladin's forces pressed the offensive further. They even got around to the rear of Richard's line, threatening another flank. The situation for the Crusaders at this point was looking really bad. The master of the Hospitallers, sensing desperation, sent word to the king, "We are violently pressed in by the enemy, my lord. We're in danger of eternal infamy if we do not dare to return their blows. Each of us is losing our horses. Why should we bear this shame any further? We must attack." To which the king responded something akin to, "I find your lack of faith disturbing," though he was actually recorded by history as saying, "Patience, good master, it is you who must resist their attack. No one can be everywhere at once. The line must hold." In Richard's mind, he was hoping to make it to the relative safety of Arsuf, but his greatest fear was for a portion of his line to break off on its own charge. Maintaining formation was everything, but then everything took on a life of its own. James Reston explains, quote, "The spark came from 2 knights, a marshal of the hospital and a Flemish knight and boon companion of Richard. Without authorization, they burst through the protecting line of infantry, shouting an invocation to St. George, and began to attack the attackers. Instantly, as if a stretched rubber band had snapped, the infantry line parted and the rest of the Hospitallers charged. The commander had no choice but to follow. The charge of the rear guard spread quickly to the center and then to the vanguard of the Templars. It was as if this brilliant dynamic strategy had been planned all along. In the center, and as if on cue, without the king lifting his hand or a trumpet sounding a single order, the cavalry charge became general. The effect of this rolling wave was devastating. The Muslim ranks broke in terror and general confusion. The front line of the Muslim attackers who were pressed in close and who had dismounted from their horses were totally cut down. An eyewitness would say their bearded heads lay thick as swathes at harvest time, and the soldiers behind them fled in disarray. End quote. Richard used the charge to his advantage. He was seen by the Sultan leading his men directly into Saladin's right flank, which broke, and then into his center, which also broke. A Muslim scribe would later write, "The rout was complete." Though being outnumbered, Richard had won the Battle of Arsuf. His casualties were about 700, the Muslims suffered an order of magnitude higher. Saladin, up on the hill looking down at the battlefield, was in total disbelief. He had lost at Acre, he had now lost at Arsuf, and as a result, he had lost considerable standing amongst his emirs. However, despite these casualties, his army was otherwise intact. What's more, from a strategic level, he could easily guess what the Crusaders would do next. However, Saladin would never again risk another pitched battle with the English king. The Sultan would go back to adopt his prior policy of hit-and-run tactics and depriving Richard of resources. This also meant the destruction of cities and fortresses that may assist in the Crusader cause. Thus, when the Crusader army arrived at Jaffa on September 9th, they found it destroyed. To the south, the even more vibrant port of Ascalon was also razed to the ground. The destruction of Ascalon, by the way, was an especially difficult decision for Saladin. It was the hinge of his empire, the city that united Egypt and Syria. But without Ascalon and Jaffa, the Sultan knew that Richard would not be able to move inland rapidly. Saladin would use this time to reorganize his forces and to destroy all forts and resources on the path to Jerusalem. The effect of this destruction was evident. Richard was now stuck at Jaffa and needed to secure his logistics. For nearly the next 2 months, the Crusaders went to work rebuilding the city. It wasn't until late October of 1191 that Richard began to slowly move towards the Holy City. He moved cautiously, retaking strong points that were destroyed by Saladin and painstakingly restoring them. All the while, the two commanders would send their men into skirmishing actions against one another. Diplomacy was also employed. At one point, Richard offered his sister's hand in marriage to Saladin's brother. This was under the premise of a combined kingdom, which, as can be imagined, really didn't work out. Richard and his army inched forward from one ruined fortress to the next. Then winter came, bringing miserable conditions of rain, hail, harsh winds. The roads turned into mud. Progress was hampered, and some of the Latin knights even began to starve. In January of 1192, the Crusader army reached the old fortress of Beit Nuba, just 12 miles from Jerusalem. But here Richard and his council determined that it would be folly to go further. Logistics were poor, and Saladin's army lay somewhere, waiting for the opportunity to strike. The decision was made to retreat, strategically of course, with the intention to take Ascalon and rebuild it. When Saladin got news of this, he was elated that he would hold Jerusalem. He disbanded his army with the orders for them to return in the spring, ready to fight again. For the next several months, the Crusader army meticulously restored Ascalon. The port could once again be used to bring in goods, and the city sat at a perfect location to block incoming supplies from Egypt, which Richard was quickly realizing was the true source of the Sultan's power. He even tried at one point to convince his men to advance and take Cairo, but alas, their obligations would only be with Jerusalem. However, Richard's keen strategic insight would not go unnoticed. Almost every subsequent crusade would now target Egypt first. Well into April of 1192, Ascalon would grow, but because of their retreat, Crusader morale had collapsed. The English king, wanting to raise more money, improve morale, and soothe divisions in his ranks, began skillful negotiations. He sold the island of Cyprus to the Templars, and reversing his previous stance, he grudgingly backed up Conrad of Montferrat's claim to be the next king of Jerusalem. Conrad, by the way, up until this point, had provided nothing to support Richard in the war effort. Indeed, he was even in negotiations with Saladin himself. But now the Marquis would be accommodating and began to mobilize his army to assist the Lionheart. Guy of Lusignan was considerably upset by this, but Richard kept him in line by giving him lordship over Cyprus. This delicate situation, however, was not to last. On April 28, 1192, in Tyre, as Conrad of Montferrat was walking through the marketplace, he was approached by two hooded men. One offered the Marquis a letter, and when Conrad reached for it, the man pulled out a dagger and stabbed him repeatedly. His accomplice did likewise from behind. Conrad was fatally wounded and died that day. It was later discovered that Rashid al-Din Sinan had arranged the hit. The Old Man of the Mountain, as he was known to the Crusaders, was leader of the Order of Assassins. Conrad's death threw the delicate political situation into total disarray. Richard did manage to maintain some semblance of order in southern Palestine, but it would take him a few months to solidify his hold. However, during this time in early 1192, the king began to receive dire warnings from his homeland. Philip Augustus was on the march, attacking his lands. Richard's brother, John, was usurping his power, and then word arrived that the two were allying themselves against Richard. The Lionheart knew he might lose his kingdom entirely if he didn't return quickly, but his commitment to the crusade came first. However, he knew he had one chance now to take the Holy City. The book, Warriors of God, brings this beautifully into perspective. Quote, on June 7th, 1192, the crusade was coming to its climax. Full of joy and expectation, the siege force set out from the land of the Philistines on the ancient road to Jerusalem. A sense of purpose filled the air. As they moved out of Ascalon and across a river of Sweetwater into the land of Samson, the spectacle was magnificent. Richard led the way on his stallion. The king was resplendent, confident, a giant among ordinary men. He reveled in the harmony that at last his righteous cause enjoyed, and for a time the attractions of his homeland were laid aside. Behind him, the column was a riot of color, a welter of hoofbeat, dust cloud, polished steel, and song. The banners of eminent European houses, of holy orders, of nations grand and small fluttered in the wind and blistering heat. The trump of 1,000 horses was punctuated by the syncopated beat of drum and tambourine, the wail of bagpipes, shan, and crumhorn. The Sultan took a last desperate measure to deny Jerusalem to the enemy. He declared that every well was to be poisoned, every spring polluted, every cistern smashed in a 2-mile cordon around the city. Water had been the key to his great victory at Hattin 5 years before. Let it be so again. On June 24th, the Great Crusader army returned to its forward position at Beit Nuba, again a mere 12 miles from Jerusalem. The camp was abuzz about the next order. When would they move? Who would have the privilege to be in the vanguard? What section of the wall would they attack first? And whose flag would be the first to be planted on the parapets? However, within a few days, the mood of the Crusader force would sour dramatically. What happened to Richard the Lionheart upon his arrival back at Beit Nuba, no historian has ever adequately explained. His command was united, the French were finally eager to attack. His siege engines were assembled, Jerusalem was nearly in sight. Saladin was evacuating the city, the Franks were confident and primed. Even the camels seemed to bray their readiness. Suddenly, inexplicably, disgracefully, the Lionheart became faint-hearted, glum-faced, and disconsolate. He went before his barons with a dire assessment of their situation. Within a day, it seems, he had concluded that the quest for Jerusalem was now hopeless. End quote. Richard's mind had shifted from tactics to grand strategy. He knew that he could take Jerusalem, but he also knew that he could never hold it. His conquest would become a salient into enemy territory, one that could be cut off from supplies, one that would require a tremendous garrison to secure. And even then, if it was surrounded, it would become nothing more than a tomb to his soldiers. From Beit Nuba, Richard the Lionheart retreated once again. The situation had devolved into a stalemate. The king was unable to conquer inland cities, and the Sultan was unable to drive the Crusaders into the sea. But there was still potential for offensive actions. However, the initiative was now firmly in Saladin's hands. The Sultan watched the Crusader army retreat from Jerusalem and tracked their movements as Richard and his men moved back to Acre. Word eventually came in mid-July that Richard was off fighting near Beirut. This was precisely what Saladin had been waiting for. He knew the time had come to act. On July 26, 1192, his forces arrived at Jaffa. A siege commenced the very next day, and the fighting became intense. While the garrison of the city was able to put up a fierce defense, it eventually had to retreat to the citadel. However, they did manage to get word out to Richard for help. The king, in response, quickly gathered 54 knights, 500 infantry, and 2,000 crossbowmen and set sail for Jaffa. 6 days into the siege, Richard arrived at Jaffa with 35 ships, eager to get into the fight, and wearing armor that only covered the upper half of his body, he jumped into the water and came ashore with his men. Their assault came directly into the Muslim flank. The attack came so suddenly and so unexpectedly that Saladin's men broke and ran. The Sultan looked on again with disbelief. He outnumbered the king by 4-1, and yet it was the Ayyubid soldiers that were running for their lives. In the subsequent days, Saladin regrouped his men east of Jaffa and attempted to conceal them in a field for a surprise attack at dawn. But as fate would have it, a Genoese soldier who was out for a morning walk discovered them. When alerted of this incoming attack, Richard took his badly outnumbered troops and created a wall of long spikes that he drove into the ground, which was a great deterrent to a cavalry charge. Behind this, he positioned his heavily armored crossbowmen, with his knights held back in reserve. When the Ayyubid attack came, it wasn't able to penetrate this line. Instead, Saladin's lightly armored horsemen took horrendous casualties, as they were simply mowed down by a shower of unrelenting crossbow bolts. And then, when they were staggered, Richard launched his knights into a fierce counterattack into the center of Saladin's line. The shock and awe of this attack crushed the Muslim center. The battle then devolved into a brawl, and in the middle of all this, Richard fought on brilliantly. However, at one point, his horse was shot out from beneath him. When Saladin saw his great opponent on foot fighting alongside his men, his sense of chivalry overtook him. He was recorded as saying, "How can this be that a king should be on foot with his men? It cannot be." And then turning to his brother, he said, "Go take these 2 Arabian horses and lead them to him. Tell him that I send them to him, that a man so great as he should not be on foot with his men." Richard graciously accepted the gift and then proceeded to exceed his own reputation as a warrior. Reston gives this justice, quote, "The battle continued and spread into the town itself. Before long, so many arrows had struck into Richard's armor that he looked like a porcupine. He was completely surrounded by the enemy, one against the multitude, and yet he emerged from a pile of dead unscathed. An emir on a richly caparisoned horse, and frustrated at Richard's flair, genius, and almost supernatural skill in battle, charged the king, only to have not only his head but half his shoulder and right arm sliced off with it. The Muslim fighters recoiled at this ghoulish sight. As the day wore on, they gave Richard a wide berth, for the king had become a one-man killing machine. He had personified his name. He was the Lionheart." End quote. The Battle of Jaffa was won by Richard. It would be the last confrontation of the Third Crusade. A treaty was struck in early September of 1192. The Crusaders would hold on to a coastal strip of cities from Tyre to Jaffa. Ascalon would be returned to Saladin after its fortifications were dismantled, and Christians would be allowed to peacefully pilgrimage to Jerusalem. It was not either to King or Sultan's liking, but what choice did they have? They had battled one another to a draw. The Sultan was exhausted, and the king had to return to his homeland where the situation had turned desperate. Richard departed on October 9th, 1192 by ship. He looked back from the stern of his vessel. The Holy Land diminished and then faded into the horizon. The Third Crusade had ended and was soon to enter into the realm of history and eventually legend. But as the 12th century came to a close, the tale of both king and sultan would be a sad one. Saladin would fight on to maintain control of his empire, but shortly after Richard's departure, he died on March 4th, 1193. He had given away most of his possessions to the poor, and it was said there was not even enough money to pay for his funeral. The Ayyubid Empire in his wake would disintegrate and fracture, fought over by rival factions and by his own children. Richard, on the other hand, would journey homeward, but before Christmas of 1192, he was captured near Vienna by Leopold, the Duke of Austria. He would remain in captivity until a large ransom was paid, and it wasn't until February 4th of 1194 that he was finally released. Once back in his native land, he continued in a near state of warfare to secure his home. However, in March of 1199, during a siege, he was struck by a crossbow bolt. Gangrene would set in, but before his death, Richard pardoned the man who shot him. For the Christians, the First Crusade was a spectacular success. The Second Crusade was a spectacular failure. The Third Crusade would be known for, well, its spectacular combatants, but in the end it was a draw. Inevitably, another crusade would be called. In 1198, the rather ironically named Pope Innocent III called for a new pilgrimage to retake Jerusalem. However, many of the warriors of this crusade would never set foot in the Holy Land. Instead of taking Jerusalem, they would instead conquer a magnificent city that was at the very heart of Christendom. The Fourth Crusade would not be remembered for its chivalry or any type of valor, but rather for its corruption and greed. It would be remembered for its infamy. The 12th century had nearly come to an end. It was the aftermath of the Third Crusade. Great kings of Europe had answered the call of holy war and went into the East. But was it worth it? Frederick Barbarossa had died in Asia Minor, and the massive army he led disintegrated in his wake. Philip Augustus called it quits shortly after the Great Siege of Acre. He returned to his French kingdom and renewed his war with the English. Then there was Richard I, who came within 12 miles of Jerusalem only to realize he would never be able to hold it. He turned back, leaving the Holy City in the hands of his worthy adversary, the renowned Sultan Saladin. Inevitably, a new crusade would be called, but was the Christian world able to adequately respond? The Byzantine Empire had enjoyed its last golden age under the Komnenian Restoration, but was now falling apart fast. Its emerging dark age was made much worse by the Angeloi Dynasty that was now in charge, arguably the most inept in Eastern Roman history. The empire they ruled was fracturing at the seams. In what had once been imperial lands, kingdoms like the Bulgarian and the Hungarian had ascended, fiercely asserting their autonomy. The French, under Philip Augustus, were bitterly engaged in a war against their old rival, the English. To his credit, the French king would masterfully lead his men and win considerable territory, but he would have little time for anything else. The English would lose their champion, Richard the Lionheart, during a siege in 1199. A lucky crossbowman hit the king and a fatal infection would set in. Richard's brother John would inherit the English throne and his war with the French. But John was not the military mastermind that his brother was. In time, John's hold on northern France would collapse. Then his nobility and barons would rise up in a major civil war, culminating with his signature on the Magna Carta in 1215. He was, to say the least, too indisposed for crusading ventures. The Holy Roman Empire would do somewhat better. Frederick Barbarossa had united the empire as never before, allowing him to go east on crusade. He had left his son, Henry VI, in charge. Henry, like his father, found himself in command of an impressive military force, and also had his father's crusading zeal. In 1195, he declared a crusade of his own. He even managed to bully the Byzantine to give him a massive tribute to pay for it. But in 1197, the emperor died of fever in Messina. All of the preparations that he had made would come to naught. What would later be known as the German Crusade would disintegrate. And to make matters worse, back at home, Henry's heir, named Frederick, was only 2 years old. Thus, it wasn't long before the once powerful Holy Roman Empire would be torn apart in civil war. It would seem that most of the major powers of Europe were in no position to fight in the Holy Land. However, from this rather chaotic state of affairs, there would be one man who would be willing to take up the task of reclaiming the Holy City. The papacy at this time was in the doldrums, ineffective and impotent under the almost forgettable pontificate of Celestine III. When he died in January of 1198, that would all change. Lothario Assegni was a powerful and dynamic man. He was born into an aristocratic and wealthy family that spent well on his education. The young Lothario attended Paris University, arguably the best education in Europe, which was soon bolstered by a formal theological and law training at Bologna, again extremely prestigious. By 1190, he had shot up through the ranks to become a cardinal. And then, at the tender young age of 37, he was elected Pope on January 8, 1198, literally the same day his predecessor died. It would have seemed that the Catholic Church was more than eager for a change, and that is precisely what they got. Now known as Innocent III, this new pope would bring a profound sense of drive, ambition, and vision. You know what? We need to go one up on that. This man wielded his papacy like a broadsword. The administration of the church was reorganized. In time, the Franciscan and Dominican orders were founded, and heresy was persecuted with a vengeance. The man really knew how to use his power. He would excommunicate kings and princes, strengthen the authority of Rome, and launched holy wars against enemies both foreign and domestic. But on the very top of his list was the recapture of Jerusalem, which became the passionate focus of his time in office. On August 15, 1198, the Fourth Crusade was formally declared. For the next few years, Innocent initiated a massive preaching campaign, sending his delegates throughout Europe. At one point, he wrote letters to various royalty and used a rhetorical device, insulting them from an Islamic standpoint. Quote, "Behold, we have now profaned your holy places, extended our hand to the objects of your desire, and have violently overrun and hold against your will those places in which you pretend your superstition began. Already we have weakened and shattered the lances of the Gauls. We have frustrated the efforts of the English. We have now, for a second time, held in check the might of the Germans. We have tamed the proud Spaniards. And although you took steps to rouse up all your powers against us, you have thus far scarcely made progress in any way. Where, then, is your God?" End quote. Innocent initially set the time of departure for his crusade to be March of 1199. But with the kings of Europe tied down by their own issues, and of course Richard I dying, Innocent came to the realization that he would not only need a new time frame, but also an entirely new group of crusaders. In late 1199 and early 1200, the call for crusade would be amplified, and in turn, his endeavor began to have an effect. On November 28, 1199, a grand tournament was held at the castle of Acre in northern France. It became a gathering of some of the most influential knights in Western Europe. Amongst all the elaborate display and pageantry, Theobald III, the Count of Champagne, stood up with his cousin Louis of Blois and brought the tournament to a halt. They made the announcement then and there for all to hear that they had taken up the cross and would go on Innocent's crusade. Now keep in mind, he was not just any ordinary noble. The young count, just 20 years of age, had holy war in his blood. He was the nephew of Richard the Lionheart, grandson of Eleanor of Aquitaine, His father had gone east during the Second Crusade and his older brother in the Third. Theobald, the Count of Champagne, was the embodiment of crusading zeal. Indeed, he was appointed leader of the Fourth Crusade. Now, there is nothing so good for recruitment as having a celebrity, or at least the descendant of one, sign up. A tipping point had been reached. Knights and nobles throughout Western Europe began to heed the call. Amongst many nobles, there was Simon of Montfort, Raynald of Montmirail, and a bit later in February of 1200, Count Baldwin of Flanders, whose name, by the way, is worth remembering. He would provide one of the larger contingents. All of them would take up the cross. Now, all that was needed was to figure out what to do. Jerusalem was, as before, the main goal, but Richard the Lionheart during the Third Crusade had noted that taking Egypt would be first needed. It was, after all, the source of immense wealth, plenty of food, and without taking the Nile, the Holy Land would never be fully secured. Thus, the grand plan, and for the record, this was kept secret from the rank and file to assure compliance, was to board ship and sail to Egypt, secure Alexandria and Cairo, and then move up through the Sinai Peninsula to take the Holy City. Of course, this would bring up the next major question, which was who would provide transportation. Trade during this time period had rebounded to a level that surpassed the era of the Roman Empire. The Italian city-states had grown powerful and wealthy as a result. The competition between them was beyond fierce. The three main seafaring city-states were Genoa, Pisa, and Venice. Now, of the three, Genoa and Pisa were actively fighting one another. They were at each other's throats. And they were also to some degree in the sphere of control of the Holy Roman Empire, which in turn wasn't exactly on great terms with the papacy. Venice, while technically part of the Byzantine Empire, held great autonomy and remained independent of German influence. By the end of the 12th century, the city boasted a population of 60,000, one of the biggest in Europe, and had become a force to be reckoned with. Therefore, it was here that the delegates of Pope Innocent III arrived in early 1201 to strike a deal. Doge Enrico Dandolo was nearly 90 years old and was blind by the end of the 12th century. There were rumors that he was blinded by the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos during a visit to Constantinople in 1172. This rumor was most assuredly false. It was true, however, that the venerable Doge had no love for the Eastern Roman Empire. This may have had something to do with the Latin massacre of Venetians that occurred in 1182 in Constantinople. More on that in a bit. The ruler of Venice was an extremely keen man, with a preternatural instinct to business and expansion. Make no mistake, he wasn't just good at business, he was ruthless. Gunther of Pers, a Cistercian monk and chronicler, admired him, saying, quote, "He was, to be sure, sightless of eye, but most perceptive of mind and compensated for physical blindness with a lively intellect, and best of all, foresight. In the case of matters that were unclear, the others always took every care to seek his advice, and they usually followed his lead in public affairs." End quote. Robert of Clary regarded Dandolo as a most worthy man. By helping out the Crusaders, he knew he could slingshot past his competition by securing hegemony over the lucrative trade routes of the Levant and Egypt. In a word, he was in, but he also realized the extreme magnitude of risk that he would be subjecting not just his people, but also himself too. Jonathan Phillips, in his book The Fourth Crusade, puts this really well. Quote, "To transport the French Crusaders to the Holy Land necessitated a level of commitment unprecedented in medieval commerce. The number of ships required would absorb almost the entire Venetian fleet, and would entail the construction of many new ships as well. A modern comparison might entail a major international airline ceasing operations for a year to prepare its planes for one particular client, and then to serve that client exclusively for a further period afterwards. As well as building the ships, the Venetians would also sail the fleet and participate in the expedition. Dandolo and his fellow citizens must have wanted the most watertight of guarantees that their labors would be rewarded in full. If the deal collapsed, then Venice faced ruin, and Dandolo himself would have to bear the enormous responsibility for that disaster. End quote. The agreement that was decided upon was for Venice to build and man enough ships to transport 4,500 horses, 4,500 knights, 9,000 squires, and 20,000 foot soldiers. Furthermore, Venice would contribute the sailors, captains, another 50 armed galleys, and enough rations for 9 months. The payment was 4 silver marks per horse and 2 silver marks per man, for a total of 85,000 marks. This was an enormous amount, equivalent to 60,000 pounds of sterling silver, or more than twice the annual revenue of the King of France. Now, part of the agreement was that Venice would get half the loot, either procured on land or on sea, not to mention any lucrative trade routes that would just happen to fall into their laps. This last point alone had the Doge panting in exuberance, dreaming of profit, and making him look past the insane amount of risk involved. But to quote the 60-second Ferengi rule of acquisition, the riskier the road, the greater the profit. So what could go wrong? An entire year would be needed for the intense labor, with the departure date set for June 29, 1202, the feast day of St. Peter and Paul. Venice would keep true to its word. Phillips explains, quote, "The heart of the Venetian shipbuilding industry was known as the Arsenal. This was, and still is, located about 750 yards east of St. Mark's, in the adjacent Castello district. The number of ships required was immense. The Crusaders were to travel on large sailing ships, often converted cargo carriers. The size of these vessels varied. The greatest, called World, and others such as Paradise and Pilgrim, had masts tall enough to reach the towers of Constantinople. To us, these ships would have appeared ugly and ungainly. They were short, rounded tubs. The horse ships, known as tarida, probably carried about 30 animals. Each beast had to be suspended in a sling to prevent sudden movements of the ship, causing them to lose their footing and injure themselves. The animals were carried deep in the boat, with the main entrance falling below the waterline. When beached on shore and ready for battle, this door could be opened, and the horses, with their riders already fully mounted, could pour out of the ship and directly into the fray. This deployment would have given the invasion force an immediate and overwhelming tactical advantage. Based on these estimates, it was apparent that the Venetians needed to employ or at least provide at least 30,000 men to sail a fleet of the size proposed in the contract. Thousands of local mariners from the Adriatic shore must have come to join the crusade as the Venetians strove to fulfill their side of the bargain." End quote. Meanwhile, in the rest of Europe, nobles were making preparations to fulfill their crusading vows. However, the appointed leader of the Fourth Crusade, Theobald III, the Count of Champagne, became gravely ill and died on May 24, 1201. The remaining senior members met to decide on his replacement. After a long search, it was decided that Boniface, the Marquis of Montferrat, would be the new leader of the Fourth Crusade. Boniface was the brother of Conrad of Montferrat, the defender of Tyre, who would have been the next king in Jerusalem had he not been killed by the assassins in 1192. Boniface was considered a brilliant man. His family's legacy brought prestige and a sense of military experience. However, he was also Northern Italian with connections to the Holy Roman Empire. This would be a major source of contention for some of the Crusaders, who were predominantly French, and not that keen on following a mere Italian marquis into holy war. But despite this, the crusade pushed on, and in the spring of 1202, it was finally time for the Latins to come together in Venice. Knights from across Europe began to move towards northern Italy. The Venetians had prepared the island of St. Nicholas, now known as Lido, as a place to house them. The island was nothing more than a sandbar, but it was expertly picked by the Doge. It was close enough to keep an eye on the Crusaders, but far enough away to make an assault on the city unlikely. Leading members of the Crusade were now allowed to visit the city and gaze upon the armada that had been created. A contemporary record had the fleet at 40 ships, 62 galleys, and 100 transports. The Gesta Innocente would say, the Venetians had prepared a magnificent fleet, the like that had not been seen since long ago. Geoffrey of Villehardouin, a chronicler of the Fourth Crusade, would comment, the fleet they had created was so fine and well equipped that no man in the whole of Christendom had ever seen one to surpass it. The Doge and his city had done their part, but it became readily apparent, even to the casual observer, that something was very wrong. Spring had become summer. The departure date of June 29th had come and gone, but by August, the headcount on the island of Lido wasn't 35,000, not even half of that. Only 12,000 Crusaders had arrived, a mere third of what was expected. There were unsettling reports coming in. Many who had taken up the cross decided to make their own way to the Holy Land. For some, like those who were coming in from England, it made practical sense. For others, they simply didn't like the leadership and bypassed Venice entirely. These contingents would later rally together in the Holy Land in Acre. However, for the Crusaders now essentially marooned on the small Venetian island, the situation was getting extremely tense. The Doge, sensing this growing calamity right in front of him, rounded up the leaders of the Crusade and bluntly put it all out in the open. Quote, Lords, you have used this for ill, for as soon as your messengers made the bargain with me, I commanded through all my land that no trader should go trading, but that all should help prepare this navy. They have waited ever since and have not made any money for a year and a half past. Instead, they have lost a great deal. Therefore, we wish, my men and I, that you should pay us the money you owe us. And if you do not do so, then know that you shall not depart from this island before we are paid. End quote. The Crusade leadership dug deep to get the funds, but could only come up with about 35,000 marks, far short of the 85,000 that was needed. The situation had become a dangerous impasse. Meanwhile, Doge Dandolo was under tremendous pressure from his people to solve this. However, he came up with an offer they couldn't refuse. 165 miles as the crow flies from Venice is the city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast. The city had been resisting Venetian control for some time. It was now time to fix that. The Doge proposed that the fleet set sail and that they all capture the city together. The way he framed it was that the spoils of this enlightened attack would offset the money that was due. It seemed simple enough, right? Except for the details. 1. The city was Christian. 2. It was under the jurisdiction of King Amico of Hungary. And 3. Amico was, well, a crusader himself, having taken up the cross for Holy War not that long ago. The proposal divided the Crusade leadership. Initially, the whole endeavor was kept secret from the rank and file, again to assure compliance. But when the destination was made known, many Crusaders simply withdrew from the expedition. However, to move things along on September 8, 1202, Doge Dandolo made the statement that he was going on crusade himself. Villehardouin recounted the scene, quote, Our men watched the Doge taking the cross with joy and deep emotion, greatly moved by the courage and wisdom shown. End quote. For the Crusaders who were dubious of Venetian motives, this was a persuasive move. Of course, the Doge had a political angle to all this. He wanted to assure his own people would go along. And it worked. Seeing the venerable man take up the cross inspired 20,000 Venetians, nearly twice the number of Crusaders, to do likewise. With that, the plan was set, and in early October, in 2 contingents, the Venetian Armada set sail. Now, along the way, they stopped to collect tribute from cities that had been otherwise reticent to cough up the funds. It wasn't personal, it was just business. And then, on November 11th, 1202, the fleet arrived at Zara. The citizens of the city had closed the gates and had placed crosses in the windows to indicate that they were also Christians. An embassy was established on November 12th, where the defenders offered to surrender the city if their lives and their possessions were to be spared. The Doge responded by saying he needed time to talk with his associates, but there was great division in the Crusader ranks on what to do next. Many were against attacking fellow Christians, but the majority felt that attacking the city was a means to an end. On November 13, 1202, the siege engines were assembled with great efficiency, the Venetian navy began a blockade, and soldiers began to disembark. The siege itself was brutal, with Crusaders either attempting to scale over the walls or to mine underneath them. The defenders put up a stout defense, but the Crusader weight of numbers would eventually win out. On November 24th, the defenders of Zara, after weeks of fighting, had had enough. The city capitulated and the sack began. After a frenzied looting, the spoils were divided up amongst the victors. Now, despite being allies, the situation in the city would remain very tense. A mere 3 days after its capture, a major fight broke out between the Venetians and the Crusaders. Phillips brings this encounter to life. Quote, "An argument broke out between groups of Frenchmen and Venetians. Conflict soon ripped through the city. What began as a localized brawl became an all-out war, the streets ringing with the clash of swords, the whirring of crossbow bolts, and the cries of the angry, the wounded, and the dying. All through the night, the riot carried on till the combatants wore themselves out and finally calm prevailed. It was fortunate that the city itself was not burned to the ground." End quote. When Pope Innocent III heard of the attack against fellow Christians, he was appalled. He took the drastic measure of excommunicating everyone on the crusade. This was a harrowing prospect for the Latin Knights, especially the rank and file, many of whom had come for the best of intentions. Some were now keen for redemption, whereas many others decided to leave the crusade altogether. As 1202 came to an end, the Crusaders and Venetians were accomplices in the fall of a fellow Christian city, a far cry from the vows of crusade. The future of their venture now seemed very uncertain and a bit dark. What would they do next? Fate at this time would intervene. The leader of the Fourth Crusade, Boniface of Montferrat, was not present during the siege of Zara. He had been at the court of Philip of Swabia and there had met a young Byzantine prince named Alexios, who was exiled and on the run. The prince knew of the Fourth Crusade, knew what kind of troubles they were having, and just happened to have an offer for them. This offer was initially kept quiet as it might have provided too much of a bad distraction. But now in the face of the Pope's excommunication and a crusade essentially stranded in Zara, all offers were given a new light. The young man promised to pay the Crusaders the insane amount of 200,000 marks, along with provisions, men, and support for the capture of Jerusalem, if they would simply come back with him to Constantinople and put him on the throne that his uncle had usurped. It was too good of an offer to refuse. Thus, in the spring of 1203, the battle-hardened Crusade army and the Grand Armada of Venice changed its path and set sail for the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Komnenian Restoration would be the last golden age of the Eastern Roman Empire. It would be followed by the darkest of days. Beginning in 1081, under Alexios I Komnenos, the empire, for the most part, would thrive politically, economically, and militarily. Alexios I, his son John II, and his grandson Manuel I would all enjoy long and relatively stable reigns. But a cornerstone of their prosperity was due to the resurgence of trade, and mark my words, this came at a price. Constantinople had a commanding position on the Bosphorus and was a major hub of commerce. The Italian city-states to the west, which had grown immensely rich on the trading boom, all wanted a part of the cosmopolitan city. Thus, the number of Latins living in the Byzantine capital soared, reaching 60 to 80,000 by the time of Manuel I's reign. Their presence was first resented, then hated, then reviled with a growing vigor. Emperor Manuel I attempted to rein them in, expelling many of the Genoese and Pisan residents. But the Venetians were not so easy to move. They knew how to fight back and had leverage. Now, while the people of the Eastern Roman Empire enjoyed the prosperity of the Komnenian Restoration, because of the perceived Latin favoritism, they really began to dislike their emperor. The fact that Manuel I truly had a love of Western culture appeared, at least on the surface, to protect the Latins, and had a Latin wife, Maria of Antioch, didn't help matters a bit. On September 24, 1180, the emperor died, leaving behind a young son. Maria of Antioch was made the queen regent, but she was nowhere up for the challenge. If anything, she was a scapegoat for the growing hostility that the Eastern Romans felt toward their Latin neighbors. This was a powder keg of Greek fire waiting to explode. The death of the emperor had left an opportunity for ambitious men in the aristocracy to seize. Andronicus I was the cousin of Manuel I. He had ambition. John Julius Norwich explains just how much. Quote, Andronicus had always had his eye on the imperial crown. He learned of the growing dissatisfaction with the empress regent. He needed little persuading that his opportunity had come at last. In August of 1182, he marched on the capital. The army and navy hastened to join him. Even before he crossed the straits, rebellion had broken out in Constantinople, and with it exploded all the city's long pent-up xenophobia. What followed was the massacre of virtually every Latin in the city: women, children, the old and infirmed, even the sick in the hospitals. Andronicus's triumph had brought out a degree of brutality that none had suspected. End quote. Now keep in mind that the majority of those that died were Venetians, something that would not be forgotten. Meanwhile, Andronicus had claimed the throne by appealing to popular support to place the Byzantine first. He did nothing to stop the massacre. The man believed in the enforcement of order. Norwich would say violence and brute force were his only weapons. He did stamp out corruption as never before and ruled with an iron fist, which was at first applauded. But soon he would resort to bizarre forms of punishment and torture to keep his aristocracy in line. There were rumors that he had gone insane. Fear and resentment began to grow, culminating in rebellion. Andronicus, sensing the change in his support, attempted to flee the city, but was caught. In the end, he reaped what he sowed. He himself was tortured for several days. Eventually, he was dragged to the hippodrome where he was hung by his feet and sword bayoneted by 2 Latin soldiers until he bled out. Now, whereas the time of Andronicus I was regarded as a reign of terror, what would come next would be even worse. The man that would come to power, Isaac II, established the Angeloi Dynasty. As mentioned before, this dynasty was regarded as one of the worst, if not the worst, in Byzantine history. Isaac was a truly inept emperor who would always seem to favor pleasure over ruling an empire. He sold high administrational offices to completely incompetent nobility. The army and the navy were left to languish, becoming dangerously weak in comparison to their neighbors, who were only honing their abilities. The emperor would squander the diminishing income of the empire for lavish gifts and immense building projects, or simply use meager funds to pay off aggressive neighbors with tribute. Although, to his credit, he was able to put down several rebellions, and indeed in 1185 he was able to fend off a Norman invasion, he was, alas, incapable of stopping the fragmentation of his empire. The Bulgarians were able to establish a strong empire in the west, along with the Hungarians and the Serbs. Byzantine supremacy in Eastern Europe would be lost, and it would never return. In the east, the Seljuks remained implacable enemies and would prevent the Eastern Empire from asserting authority in Asia Minor. Even the island of Cyprus during this time would break off. Isaac II Angelos could do little but watch this happen, but the empire would not tolerate him for long. John Phillips, in his book The Fourth Crusade, described what happened next. Quote, "Conspirators plotted to replace Isaac with his brother Alexios Angelos, whom they hoped would be more sympathetic to their wishes. A hunting expedition to Thrace offered the perfect opportunity. On the 8th of April 1185, as the imperial party left the main camp and rode off to hunt, Alexios and his men made their move. Once Isaac was fully engaged in the chase, the conspirators led their man to the imperial tent and acclaimed him emperor. Isaac learned exactly what had happened. He thought to charge back into the camp, but his men were too few to fight effectively, and so he fled. Alexios followed in pursuit, knowing that he had to capture his brother before he got back to Constantinople. Isaac was soon caught and taken to the monastery of Vera in southern Thrace. There, as Nikitas tells us, he endured an excruciating torture. He looked upon the sun for the last time and his eyes were gouged out. The Byzantine judged that blinding rendered an individual unfit to rule. Isaac was then cast into prison. Once enthroned, Alexios III, as he became known, kept Isaac under a relaxed house arrest and extracted a promise from him and his son, Prince Alexios, that they would never conspire against him. Unsurprisingly, that promise was never kept." End quote. Now, while Isaac II was regarded as being a poor emperor, his brother was even worse. Alexios III squandered what was left of the treasury to pay tribute to maintain the peace, but this did very little. The Seljuks would continue to overrun Asia Minor, and the Bulgarians and the Hungarians would continue to overrun the Balkans. The Byzantine army and navy were neglected even more, becoming a shadow of their former selves. Indeed, the once proud Roman fleet was now reduced to a few derelict vessels. Even their anchors went missing, sold off by corrupt officials. But of all the mistakes that Alexios III had made, leaving his brother Isaac and his nephew Prince Alexios alive was perhaps his greatest. As Isaac II languished in his prison in Constantinople, he began to formulate a plan with his son Prince Alexios to help him reclaim the throne. The young prince hired 2 Pisan merchants to help him escape the capital, and then eventually fled to the court of Philip of Swabia, his brother-in-law, who also happened to be the king of Germany. It was here in the autumn of 1202, as the Venetian fleet was making its way towards Zara, that Alexios met Boniface of Montferrat, again the leader of the Fourth Crusade. Alexios learned of the plight of the Crusaders, that is, how much they were in debt to Venice. He came up with an offer that he felt was for their mutual benefit. Geoffrey of Villehardouin recorded its content, quote, "Since you are on the march and in the service of God, and for right and justice, it is your duty to restore their possessions to those who have been wrongfully dispossessed. Prince Alexios will make you the best of terms. First, if God permits you to restore his inheritance to him, he will place his whole empire under the authority of Rome. Second, since he is aware that you have spent all your money and now have nothing, he will give you 200,000 silver marks. Moreover, he himself will go in your company to Egypt with 10,000 men, or if you prefer it, send the same number of men with you. And furthermore, so long as he lives, he will maintain at his own expense 500 knights to keep guard in the land overseas." End quote. By the time this became common knowledge, the Crusaders had laid siege to, taken, and then looted Zara, another Christian city, and as a result, they had been excommunicated by the Pope. As they wintered in Zara from 1202 to 1203, they knew that they were in a desperate situation, not to mention that they still owed the Venetians a considerable amount of money. Alexios' offer divided the Crusaders, and many of them just simply left the pilgrimage altogether, or made their way to the Holy Land on their own. Doge Dandolo and his Venetian contingent were initially very apprehensive, but they saw this as a financial way out of the debacle that they were in and decided to back up the plan. Despite the division in the Crusader ranks, a majority also supported the move on Constantinople. They would eventually get their chance. In February of 1203, Innocent III lifted the excommunication order he had placed on the Fourth Crusade, acknowledging that the rank and file were under a lot of duress. This absolution, however, didn't apply to the Venetians who refused to repent. Thus, for the most part, the Fourth Crusade was once again the warriors of God. Now, it needs to be pointed out that while Innocent didn't directly support the Crusader diversion to Constantinople, he didn't condemn it either. Later historians would criticize this. Some argued that the appeal of putting the Byzantine Empire under papal authority was simply too tempting for Innocent III. But either way, Constantinople was now the next destination. In the spring of 1203, the Venetian fleet underwent refit and prepared to leave. As a farewell and gesture of strength, Zara was razed to the ground. Its fortifications and city walls were dismantled, only the churches were spared. Then on April 7th, the fleet left Zara and headed for Durazzo, which capitulated to the authority of Prince Alexios. This was an encouraging development, but the enthusiasm was not to last. John Phillips explains the situation at their next destination. Quote, "The city of Corfu refused to open its gates, and the inhabitants declared their opposition to Alexios by using catapults to compel the Crusader fleet to withdraw. This antipathy towards the young prince made it clear that he could not count on a friendly welcome throughout the empire, and that loyalty to the existing regime was not as brittle as he would have liked." End quote. The Fourth Crusade made camp just outside of Corfu, where Prince Alexios physically joined them. For a brief time, the Crusaders reorganized. On May 24, 1203, the fleet left Corfu, rounded the tip of Greece, and then made its way across the Aegean. The city of Abydos on the Hellespont surrendered prudently, and then, finally, on June 23, 1203, the Fourth Crusade arrived at Constantinople. The sight, for many, was overwhelming. The magnitude of the grand city and its impressive fortifications was frightening, even to the bravest man. But the people of Constantinople were equally apprehensive. The Venetian fleet was a spectacle to behold. It paraded before them along the Sea of Marmara, before landing and establishing camp on the Asian shore across the Bosphorus. By June 26, the Fourth Crusade was firmly entrenched within view of the city at Chalcedon and Skotarin. Alexios III, who had heard that the fleet was approaching, began preparations for the defense, repairing the city walls, bringing in supplies, and refitting the decrepit fleet. But the emperor's efforts were half-hearted at best. Indeed, crops that were just harvested were left within reach for the Crusaders to simply take. However, Alexios III could still rely on his army, which was formidable, but not quite the well-disciplined force it had been under Manuel I. A delegation was sent in early July offering the Crusaders tribute if they would leave. This was rejected as the Latins insisted that Prince Alexios needed to be restored to the throne. A fight seemed inevitable. Meanwhile, Doge Dandolo came up with a last-ditch plan to avoid confrontation. Prince Alexios was placed on a ship and was sailed near the city on display. There was still some hope that popular support would welcome in the young man and see his uncle usurped. However, the reception that he got was extremely poor, and it began to dawn on the Latins that not only had they put too much faith in the prince, but now they would most likely have to fight their way forward. The Crusader High Command gathered to formulate their plan. The walls of Theodosius II, the legendary triple land walls of Constantinople, were nearly impregnable. The seawall along the north of the city next to the safe harbor, the Golden Horn, was the weak point. But first they would need access to that body of water, and that was protected by a massive chain that blocked the harbor, of which one end of that massive chain was secured in the city of Galata, just north of the Golden Horn, and thus it would be here that they decided to begin their attack. July 5th, 1203 was a clear, fine morning, ideally suited for one of the greatest amphibious assaults in medieval history. The Crusaders moved into position to land just north of Galata. Alexios III at this point had already deployed his army into position. Crossbowmen and archers were placed on the Venetian galleys and began a shore bombardment of bolts and arrows. Under this cover, the horse ships were brought up. The front doors on the ships were brought down, and knights that were already mounted and in full armor poured out into an awe-inspiring battle formation. The Emperor's men saw exactly what was coming next, a full-on charge, but most didn't wait around to see this happen. They broke and ran for their lives. Alexios III abandoned his position so quickly that he left his tent, pavilion, and a wealth of money behind. His men, at least those that managed to escape, retreated to Galata. That night, the Crusaders brought up reinforcements and camped out near the town. But the next morning, Alexios III had brought in his own reinforcements from Constantinople. At 9 a.m. on the morning of July 6th, the Byzantine counterattacked and surprised their enemies. The Crusaders were initially cut down. But as the battle dragged on, the Emperor's attack began to lose steam. The Imperial forces were then the ones that were forced back, with the Crusaders in hot pursuit. Sensing an opportunity, the Latins pressed the attack. The Byzantine defenders began to fall back in total disarray from this onslaught. Nikitas Choniates would remark, quote, "It was a sight to behold, the defenders fleeing after a brief resistance. Some were slain or taken alive, and others slid down the chain as though it were a rope and boarded the Roman triremes, while many others lost their grip and fell headlong into the deep." End quote. Shortly thereafter, the citadel, the Galata Tower, was taken by storm. Resistance collapsed and the city surrendered. The chain that blocked the harbor was then cut, and the Venetian fleet sailed into the Golden Horn. Phillips explains the situation well. Quote, "The Byzantine vessels laid at the Venetians' mercy. The attack galleys hunted down the sorry remains of the Greek fleet, sinking some and capturing others, while a few chose to scuttle their ships rather than be taken. Breaking the chain was a tremendous blow to the Byzantine. Tearing through this vital protective barrier meant the Westerners could now push into the inner waters of the Golden Horn. This in turn allowed them to bring their fleet close up to the walls, dramatically increasing the pressure on the Byzantine." End quote. Even though Galata and the Golden Horn were now secured, the Crusader position was still precarious. The immense city could not be blockaded entirely. The Byzantine army was still formidable, supplies were running out, and the relatively small Crusader force would not be able to attack anything more than a small portion of the city walls. The Fourth Crusade thus began the next phase of their operations. The next 4 days were spent resting and repairing weapons and siege equipment. Then, on July 11th, the Crusaders marched 2 miles up the Golden Horn to a stone bridge that crossed the water. The Emperor had ordered the bridge destroyed, but this was carried out so poorly that it took Latin engineers only a day to rebuild it. Once across the bridge, the Crusaders set up a forward camp just outside the most northwestern part of the city. The Venetians also used this time to their benefit. Robert of Clary left us a great description. Quote, "The Venetians took the diagonal beams from which the sails were hung and lashed enough of them high up on the mast to form a makeshift bridge. These bridges, measuring about 110 feet long, were then covered in planks to form a walkway wide enough for 3 or 4 knights. Handrails and coverings of hide and canvas were then added to protect the attackers against arrows and crossbow bolts. In effect, they had suspended huge leather and wooden tubes high above their ships from which the bodies of heavily armed knights might be disgorged onto the battlements of Constantinople. End quote. On July 17th, the assault began. Boniface of Montferrat was left to guard the Crusader camp, while Baldwin of Flanders led his men against the wall. The Venetians attacked from the Golden Horn to support the assault. Alexios III had placed his elite Varangian guard to defend against the incoming attack. The fighting became horrendous. The Crusaders would breach the fortifications sporadically, only to meet stiff resistance. The Latin attackers suffered heavy losses and were then driven off. Meanwhile, Doge Dandolo had deployed his fleet along a longer portion of the northern wall. With the bulk of the Byzantine army, including the Varangians, defending the land walls, relatively little was left to defend the sea walls, which were only a single line thick. The Venetian ships unleashed a massive barrage, crossbowmen shooting bolts, archers firing arrows, and men aboard deck launching catapult attacks. In the midst of all this fighting, the Doge sensed his men were not making enough of an impact. He ordered his vermilion galley, the banner of St. Mark fluttering in the wind, to go to the vanguard, then instructed his men to row him ashore at the head of the attack. His men looked on with disbelief but were inspired by the old man's bravado. The Venetians intensified their attack. The defenders, on the other hand, were shocked by the frenzied assault and began to fall back. The fortifications were breached, the Venetians poured in, and in no time, 25 towers were taken. Then the attack spread into the city itself. The struggle became even more desperate. Pisan merchants who lived in the city took up arms to repulse the invaders. Alexios redeployed his Varangian guard at this new threat. The elite soldiers of the emperor plowed into the Venetians and managed to turn the tide. Taking in significant losses, the Venetians pulled back to the wall. In desperation to slow down the Varangian, they set multiple fires in their hasty retreat. The fires began to spread and became a massive conflagration that gutted entire neighborhoods. Historians would later estimate that 120 acres of the city was consumed in the ensuing firestorm. Now, with the Venetians retreating and the Crusaders driven off, Alexios III determined it was time to go on the offensive. The emperor ordered most of his army to march out of the city. A second contingent was left in reserve intended as a later surprise attack. It was at this point that the Crusaders realized just how outnumbered they really were. It was nearly 3-1. Geoffrey of Villehardouin, seeing the numbers before him, was exasperated. He would lament, "You would have thought that the whole world was assembled there." The Venetians abandoned most of their positions along the northern wall to back up their allies, Doge Dandolo declaring that he would live or die alongside his comrades. The Crusaders formed up into a tight and well-disciplined formation, but the staggering army before them led to extreme measures. Stable boys and cooks were pressed into service. They were armed with kitchen implements, cooking pots for helmets, heavy blankets as armor. Meanwhile, Emperor Alexios III brought up even more reinforcements. The backdrop of his impressive city, with menacing, billowing clouds of dark smoke, only added to his alarming presence. Both armies slowly advanced towards one another. Just outside a crossbow range with the small river Lycus between them, both forces paused to size one another up. The Crusader High Command at this point fell into disagreement on what to do next. Meanwhile, the Emperor, it would seem, had them. All that was needed now was the order to attack. But that order never came. Instead, the standoff would continue and wore on well into the day. Then, seemingly out of nowhere and incredibly, Alexios III instructed his troops to withdraw. The puzzled and somewhat confused Venetians and Crusaders looked on as the behemoth imperial army retreated back into the city. Alexios' actions were a disgrace. His people were enraged, and the fact that the fires were still raging only intensified their hatred. His aristocracy approached him and threatened to replace him with his nephew if he didn't act. Grudgingly, he promised to attack the next day. However, that very night, the night of July 17th, 1203, Alexios III collected 1,000 pounds of gold, as much wealth as he could carry, and then around midnight, he abandoned Constantinople to its fate. Nikitas Koniatis would say, it was as though he had labored hard to make a miserable corpse of the city, to bring her utter ruin in defiance of her destiny, and by doing so, he had hastened along her destruction. The following morning, news that the great city on the Bosphorus no longer had an emperor shattered its morale. With little recourse, Isaac II was run out of his prison and placed on the throne. Messengers were sent to the young Prince Alexios informing him of this. He would later enter the city along with his Venetian and Crusader allies to take their place next to his father. The prince would be crowned as Emperor Alexios IV. To his credit, he had managed to reclaim his inheritance. Now, however, it was time to repay his debt to those that had helped him. But when the young prince, now emperor, looked into his treasury, he found it was nearly empty. Even though he had become the next emperor, his greatest challenge lay before him. Alexios IV found himself surrounded by a vengeful nobility. His funds were depleted, and he had a completely bloodthirsty army on his doorstep. The imperial palace in Constantinople was a magnificent sight. It was envied by the world, not just for its beautiful edifice, but for the power and the wealth it projected. However, deep below were the dungeons, home to villains, criminals, and political prisoners alike, slowly being tortured and left to rot away. The young man who had been recently imprisoned there was the latter. His very existence was now a political threat to the new regime who had taken power. His fortune had finally run out. A mere week and a half before, he was more than a starving body chained in a dark cell. He was at that point nothing less than the Emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. He was known as Alexios IV. He had been a prisoner before when his father was usurped by his uncle. At that time, the then Prince Alexios had managed to flee the city and then rerouted the Fourth Crusade along with the entire Venetian fleet to Constantinople. In an amazing display of perseverance, he and his Western allies had taken the great city on the Bosphorus in 1203. But it was now February 8th, 1204. Heavy footsteps could be heard approaching his cell. The door flew open, and the new emperor, Alexios V of the Ducas family, entered. This new emperor could no longer tolerate the young man's life. An army of bloodthirsty crusaders camped out near his walls wanted the prior regime to be restored. Alexios V Ducas had deprived his prisoner of food and water, instead providing him with drinks of hemlock for a merciful way out, but these were rejected. At which point, Alexios V decided to take matters into his own hands, literally. He approached the chained figure before him, and clasping his hands around the prisoner's throat, proceeded to strangle the life out of him. The murder of the young Alexios IV was the breaking point of Byzantine and Crusader relations. It was now going to be a war to the death. But this critical and precarious situation had not always been the case. 6 months before, the young prince and his allies had won an outstanding, albeit surprising, victory. When the prince's uncle, Alexios III, had fled, Constantinople was left without an emperor, at which point the prince's father, Isaac II, was brought out of prison, dusted off, and placed on the throne. For the Latin Crusaders, it was a time to remember. To them, they had restored the young Prince Alexios to his inheritance, and thus they felt justified in their actions. The leaders of the Fourth Crusade were then brought into the city, ushered into the imperial palace, and celebrated their success. John Phillips, in his book The Fourth Crusade, recounts the tale, which carries just a bit of foreshadowing. Quote, "They were taken into one of the ceremonial halls, and there, waiting for them, was the Byzantine court in all its splendor. At the end of the hall, seated on the imperial thrones, was Isaac II and his wife Margaret, the sister of King Amico of Hungary. Wilhelm, again a chronicler of the Fourth Crusade, described the emperor as being dressed in the most costly robes imaginable. He was also quite taken by the empress, whom he described as a very beautiful woman. Wilhelm appreciated the irony in seeing the couple seated there in such splendor, when only the previous day they had been held prisoners by the very same people who now fawned around them. If these people could change allegiance to one of their own so quickly, what could be said about their loyalty to outsiders?" End quote. When the feast was underway, Wilhelm approached Emperor Isaac II to discuss business. He recounted to the elderly and blind ruler the vast promises that his son had made in order to bring the Crusaders to his rescue. Isaac's response when he took in the breadth of the promises that his son had made was stunned silence. He was absolutely horrified at what was now due to those who had liberated him. Later, the emperor met with Prince Alexios. They were both well aware that the treasury was depleted, and thus they determined they simply needed more time to repay what they owed. The Crusaders and the Venetians accepted this. They established Galata as their base and then awaited what was due. Relations were still cordial. Indeed, many in the ranks of the Fourth Crusade were happy to see the young prince crowned as co-emperor. If nothing else, it meant that they had a higher chance of getting paid. On August 1st, 1203, Prince Alexios, aged only 21, became Alexios IV. He now ruled the Eastern Roman Empire along with his father. Alexios IV got to work right away. To fulfill his first promise, he announced that the Greek Orthodox Church would submit itself to the authority of the Pope. For those in the Fourth Crusade, this move gave their endeavors some degree of legitimacy in the eyes of the West. But, as can be imagined, this didn't go over well with the Roman people. What would happen next would be even worse. Emperor Alexios IV paid the Venetians 50,000 marks, which was just an enormous sum, along with an additional 36,000 to the Doge personally. This paid off what the Crusaders owed Doge Dandolo and his people. However, according to what the emperor had promised, much more was still owed, but by now the treasury was completely empty. With desperation and a bloodthirsty army at his doorstep, Alexios IV resorted to raiding the churches of Constantinople en masse. Nikitas Koniates, a more contemporary chronicler, described what he felt was the destruction of the empire's integrity. Quote, "In utter violation of the law, he touched the untouchable, whence I think the Roman state was totally subverted and disappeared. The emperor's men went to their work with vigor. It was a sight to behold. The holy icons of Christ consigned to the flames, after being hacked to pieces with axes and cast down, their adornments carelessly and unsparingly removed by force, and the revered and all-hallowed vessels seized from the churches with utter indifference, then melted down and given to the enemy troops as common silver and gold." End quote. The new emperor's approval rating dropped like a rock. He knew he was in an extremely precarious position. On one end, he had to keep his people and nobility happy while taking their money to give to the ravenous crusaders whose expectations never seemed to cease. At the same time, Alexios knew that the crusader presence was all that kept him from being ousted from power and likely executed. In exasperation, he would remark to them, "The Greeks, I must tell you, hate me because of you. If you leave me, I shall lose my empire, and they will put me to death." Thus, when the Venetian contract was set to expire in September, Alexios offered them even more to stay. Money worked. Doge Dandolo agreed, committing his men to stay in the service of the Crusade till Christmas of 1204. For better and for worse, Alexios had managed to retain the services of the Crusader army for yet another year. Expensive as they were, not only to pay but also to room and board, he had to do that as well, they did serve their purpose. The emperor's people and aristocracy stayed in line. Fear of another attack and, more importantly, another fire was just too much of a risk for them to take, at least at this point. Now, as he did have these men in his employment, Alexios decided that he was going to put them to work. It was, after all, a very experienced army at this point. Shortly after he came to power, in mid-August, he set out with his allies on campaign to reassert his dominance over his newly won empire. This force moved west into Thrace, towards Adrianople, where Alexios III, again his uncle, had fled. Many cities along the way acknowledged the young emperor as sovereign. These very same cities were then systematically shaken down for as much money as they could cough up. With a powerful army at your back and the reputation that they carried, no one is going to disagree with handing over tribute. Now, it was later remarked by historians that the young Alexios IV seemed to come into his own and prosper commanding this force. He gained confidence and prestige with his relatively successful campaign under his belt. Granted, it wasn't a complete success. His uncle, Alexios III, escaped and went further west. What's more, the king of Bulgaria, Iohannis, whose kingdom had broken away from Greek rule in the 1180s, failed to recognize him as a ruler. This, by the way, would come back to haunt the Byzantines down the line. Now, the rest of his campaign was uneventful, but Alexios' homecoming to the great city would be anything but tranquil. On August 19th, 1203, just a few days after the emperor and his crusading force had left on campaign, a major fight broke out in the city. It was going to be a fight between Greek and Latin. 2 decades prior, in 1182, the Byzantine people had slaughtered their Latin neighbors in Constantinople. In what was known as the Latin Massacre, the blood of Europeans from the West, that is, men, women, and children, filled the streets of the Queen of Cities. Now it was time for payback. Latin soldiers, sensing a chance for revenge, piled into the fight, and the brawl became into a massive confrontation. In the middle of all this, a fire broke out. While the fire that broke out on July 17th during the Venetian attack was bad enough, this new blaze would make it pale in comparison. In the dry summer heat, the fire grew out of control. It scorched a path from the Golden Horn all the way south to the Sea of Marmara. The firestorm was so intense that ships sailing by were set ablaze. The fire gutted the heart of the city, cutting a path of destruction that was estimated to be over 440 acres large. John Phillips described the scene, quote, "The fire twisted and meandered like a starving beast, gorging itself on everything in its path. It was not just the wooden buildings that fell prey to the inferno. The great agora was consumed. Its elegant porticos toppled to the ground, while mighty columns were ensnared and licked to destruction by the flames. The Crusaders, based on the opposite shore, the Golden Horn in Galata, could only watch as the fire devoured great churches, huge private houses, and wide streets packed with merchant shops. Smoke billowed into the sky as the flames leaped from building to building. Screams of the trapped and dying pierced the air. The crackle of burning wood, the abrasive rattle of disintegrating stonework, the percussive thud of falling masonry, pierced by the sharper staccato crack of shattering roof tiles. And all of this would come together to generate a truly hellish noise. End quote. When Alexios IV returned to his city, he was a detested man. His people blamed him for bringing these intruders and for the violence that they had wrought, which had now crescendoed into this conflagration. The young emperor's position would only deteriorate further as he continued to strip churches, including the Hagia Sophia, of their treasures to pay the Western soldiers. As summer turned to autumn and then into winter, the situation in the great city became ever more critical. In fact, despite the Crusader occupying force, the people of Constantinople would turn increasingly to violence. Angry mobs began to form, skirmishes became more intense, and one man in particular, Alexios Doukas, a nobleman known as Mort Zouflos, who ironically was freed from prison by the emperor's regime, became the tip of the spear of the anti-Crusade faction. Alexios Doukas would personally lead his men to attack the foreign occupiers, barely escaping death in a few encounters. Byzantine Crusader clashes got worse. As the fighting intensified, the Byzantine would then also turn their anger against the Venetian fleet. In early 1204, fire ships were sent into the armada that was docked in the Golden Horn, and this was done on more than just one occasion. It was only the skill of Dandolo's sailors that managed to keep the damage done to the Venetian ships at a minimum. Meanwhile, to make matters even more precarious, Alexios IV declared in December of 1203 that he would stop payments to the Crusaders, to which the Crusader High Command responded that if refused payment, they would do everything in their power to recover the money due. Doge Dandolo, when he heard about this, was furious and would remark, quote, "Wretched boy, we dragged you out of the filth, and into the filth we will cast you again. I defy you and give you warning that if you do not pay, I will do you all the harm in my power from this moment forwards." End quote. Alexios IV was trapped in the middle of a war that was erupting all around him. The only real question for him now was which side was the greater threat. Ultimately, and kinda sadly, the greatest blow would now fall from his own court. On the night of January 27th, 1204, Alexios Doukas, again the nobleman known as Mort Zouflos, made his move. He had already secured the treasury by bribing the officials in charge. He had convinced the Varangian Guard to join his side by telling them that the emperor was about to let the Crusaders enter the city. Then, in the middle of the night, with an armed escort, he entered the sleeping chambers of Alexios IV, had him literally dragged from his bed and thrown into a prison cell. It happened like clockwork, and there was almost no resistance. Alexios Doukas then cemented his victory. Within hours, he was declared by his people as the new emperor, and later crowned on February 5th, 1204 as Alexios V. Yeah, that's right, another Alexios, because, hey, that's just how history is sometimes. When the prior elderly co-emperor Isaac II heard of his son's imprisonment, he grew ill and died soon after, at least according to the record. Assassination or poisoning would not have been that far out of context here. Alexios V immediately took an offensive stance and demanded that the Venetians and the Latin Crusaders depart in 7 days, or, as he would say, face death. During that time, the new emperor got ready for an all-out war. The walls of Constantinople were reinforced, wooden barriers were added to the top of the seawalls, and supplies were brought into the city. It needs to be pointed out that even though the Byzantine army outnumbered the Latin one, it was not as cohesive a fighting force. The Crusaders at this point were a well-honed fighting machine. The Roman army, on the other hand, suffered from decades of neglect. Indeed, in one major encounter between Alexios V and a Latin foraging party, the emperor sent in an overwhelming 4,000 men only to watch them get routed. Alexios V in this engagement had to flee so quickly that he dropped his imperial standard. With direct confrontation not working out so well, the emperor resorted to diplomacy. On February 7th, he sent an envoy to negotiate. This envoy promised money if the Crusaders just simply left. This was promptly rejected. The Crusaders would have nothing to do with this new emperor. They wanted the young Alexios IV back in the throne. It was clear to the new regime now that this young man's life could no longer be tolerated. The very next day, Alexios V killed his predecessor. There would now only be war. Both sides now geared up for the confrontation. Alexios V rallied his men as best as he could and continued to fortify his walls. The Crusaders and their Venetian allies came together in March of 1204 to plan what to do next. They felt that leaving and going to the Holy Land empty-handed was not exactly optimal. Instead, they planned to attack and conquer. Indeed, their confidence was so high that they decided then and there how to divide the Eastern Empire once the city was taken. The attack came on April 9th, 1204 and was directed against the seawalls where the Venetians had had their success the prior year. The Crusaders arrived at the northwest portion of the city and disembarked in front of the walls. Scaling ladders and battering rams were brought to bear under the cover of a massive crossbow and catapult attack. Morale was high. The thirst for fame and fortune overcame the fears of a quick death. But the defenders were equally determined and for once had a committed leadership. Alexios V set up a forward command base at the monastery of Pantepoptis, where he directed his men fiercely. He knew that as defenders, they had the advantage. The improved defenses with the elevated wooden walls on top of the stone seawalls were too high for the Venetians to simply drop down on top of. The attackers were left to a dismal prospect of a direct assault, to which the Byzantine fought back. Scaling ladders were pushed down, boiling oil drenched the attackers. Scores of arrows inflicted heavy casualties. Both sides fought tenaciously, but as the day wore on, the backbone of the Crusaders' strike faltered. They were first pushed back, and then their retreat became an all-out rout. At the end of that day, it became evident that the attack had failed. However, Crusader determination and Venetian ingenuity did not diminish. Doge Dandolo ordered his ships lashed together so that even larger siege towers could be constructed on top of them, giving his men the ability to go over the heightened defenses of the city. On April 12, 1204, the fight began anew. Once again, the Crusaders rushed the defenses of the seawall. Once again, the defenders held the line. Casualties began to mount up, and it looked like it was going to be another defeat for the Crusaders. Then, suddenly, a strong wind came in and pushed the Venetian ships so close to the walls that their masts touched the towers. The Doge immediately rallied his men to seize this opportunity. His men climbed to the top of the siege towers. There, balanced 95 feet above, swaying back and forth with the waves below, they had to time their jumps well. One can only ponder what would drive a man to such action. While some fell 9 stories to their death, many landed on the walls and began a ferocious fight with the elite Varangian guard that awaited them below. Meanwhile, at ground level, the fight continued. John Phillips brings this to life. Quote, Peter, the Lord of Amiens, took the initiative. He realized the importance of creating a hole in the wall at sea level. When he caught sight of a small bricked-up gate, he resolved to breach it. Some of his men crouched down to break through the wall. Their colleagues hunched over them using shields for protection against the missiles that rained down upon them. When the Greeks saw the Crusaders' intentions, they rushed to defend the gate. A deluge of crossbow bolts and stones rained down into the Crusaders' screen of shields. The Byzantines brought up vats of boiling pitch and Greek fire and poured them down into the Westerners. But by a miracle of God, the Crusaders seem not to have been seriously burned or crushed. The determination of these men was remarkable. It is on such acts of courage that entire wars can be turned. Axes, swords, bars, and picks were used to shatter the brickwork, and thus, finally, they created a ragged hole through which they could enter the city. End quote. The Latins rushed through the breach. No more than 70 initially made it through, but this had a major effect on Byzantine morale, which began to deteriorate. The emperor tried to rally his men, but a tipping point had been reached. More towers along the wall were taken, their gates were thrown wide open, and then the fight began to spread into the city. Eventually, even Alexios' forward base was overrun. The conflict would continue well into the night as the Eastern Romans began to fall back. During the assault, another fire broke out, the third that the Crusaders had brought, and with that, morale collapsed. The people of the city panicked and began to flee entirely. Seeing the collapse imminent, that night, Alexios V gathered what money he could and around midnight abandoned Constantinople. With his abandonment, a desperate nobility elected a warrior by the name of Constantine Lascaris to be the next emperor. But despite his boasting that he could turn the tide, he too realized that the cause was hopeless. He too would abandon the city, making it 3 emperors to do so in a 10-month period. When news of this spread, even the Varangian Guard ran. When the sun arose the next day, all resistance was over. The city was taken, and one of the greatest sacks since the fall of Rome was about to begin. John Julius Norwich, in his book, A Short History of Byzantium, conveys the magnitude of this catastrophe. Quote, "Once the walls were breached, the carnage was dreadful. Only at nightfall did the conquerors call a truce and withdraw to their camp in one of the great squares of the city. The next morning they awoke to find all resistance at an end. But for the people of Constantinople, the tragedy had scarcely begun. Not for nothing had the Franks waited so long outside the world's richest capital. Now that the customary 3 days looting was allowed to them, they fell on it like locusts. Never since the barbarian invasions had Europe witnessed such an orgy of brutality and vandalism. Never in history had so much beauty, so much superb craftsmanship been wantonly destroyed in so short a space of time. The Fourth Crusade, if indeed it can be so described, surpassed even its predecessors in faithlessness and duplicity, in brutality and greed. By the sack of Constantinople, Western civilization suffered a loss greater than the sack of Rome in the 5th century or the burning of the Library of Alexandria in the 7th. Byzantium never recovered. Instead, the empire was left powerless to defend itself. There are few greater ironies in history than the fact that the fate of Eastern Christendom should have been sealed by men who fought under the banner of the cross." End quote. After the sack, what was left was brought together and divided. The Venetians received 150,000 marks, the French Crusaders 50,000, with an additional 100,000 divided up amongst them. This was an immense wealth, which far outstripped the income of the great kings of Western Europe. But it didn't end there. Constantinople was also systematically stripped of its culture. Aside from the loss of wealth, ornaments and books, statues and tomes of knowledge were destroyed. The loss for humanity was priceless. Even the triumphal quadriga, the 4 huge gilded bronze horses that were on display in the hippodrome, were taken down. They were shipped west as a trophy of war. To this very day, they reside on the facade of St. Marco's Basilica in Venice. The lands of the once proud Eastern Empire were divided into a multitude of states, many coming under the occupation of foreign rulers. Constantinople and its surrounding lands would now become the Latin Empire. The Crusaders debated at length who would be its new ruler. Eventually, Baldwin of Flanders, with his deep connections with the Venetians, was, quote, elected to be in charge. The Eastern Romans themselves would go on to establish 3 successor states: the Empire of Nicaea, which would be governed by the Lascarid dynasty, the Empire of Trebizond under the Komnenid, and the Despotate of Epirus with the Ducas family. But perhaps we're getting too far ahead. Returning to Constantinople on May 16, 1204, just a month after the city fell, a new emperor, a Latin emperor, was being crowned. John Phillips brings this decisively home, and I quote, "Baldwin walked to the altar of the Hagia Sophia, partially damaged during the conquest. At the altar, after Baldwin had knelt in prayer to give thanks for the Crusaders' victory, the bishops stripped him to the waist to signify his humility before God. They anointed him, redressed him, and finally gathered around him. Each held the crown with one hand, and then they blessed it, making the sign of the cross before placing it on his head. Then they withdrew to reveal the new emperor of Constantinople in all his magnificence, a tangible manifestation of the power and the riches that the Crusaders had seized. Baldwin sat on a high throne, holding in one hand a scepter and in the other a golden orb. One can only imagine his feelings and thoughts as he faced the huge crowd, all magnificently attired and jeweled in silken robes. As the congregation chanted the Mass, Baldwin's mind perhaps turned to his northern European home, the cold, marshy lands of Flanders. He may have thought of the wife he would now summon to be his empress. He could have reflected upon his illustrious crusading ancestors. He may have remembered the suffering and sacrifice of his fellow men as they fought to capture Constantinople. Finally, amidst all the opulence and excitement at the dawning of a new era, he may have remembered that the Fourth Crusaders had first set out to recapture the holy city of Jerusalem and not to destroy, as they had, the greatest civilization in Christendom." End quote.